It's August 12th, 2016. The US presidential election is less than 3 months away, and for Donald Trump, things aren't looking very good. Whilst it was extremely impressive that he managed to win the Republican nomination as a complete political outsider, no one seriously thought he stood a chance of becoming the president come November. His opponent, Hillary Clinton, was a juggernaut of the Democratic Party who'd served in the Senate as Secretary of State under Obama, and with a last name like that, she seemed destined to become the first female president of the United States. Now sure, she wasn't the most likable candidate, and it's hard to imagine a human being with less charisma, but those issues were nothing in comparison to the PR nightmare that was Donald J. Trump. He had zero experience in government, his personality was extremely abrasive, and he was always shrouded in one controversy or another. This is why Trump found himself trailing in every single poll by the middle of August, with the New York Times giving him just a 12% chance of winning the November election. As I said, things did not look good. Trump was staring down the prospect of a total electoral annihilation, and he needed to do something if he wanted to keep his presidential ambitions alive. So, with the help of his closest advisors, Trump began to develop a backup plan. It was going to be an extremely risky gambit, but given how far he trailed in the polls, there really wasn't all that much to lose. So, on the 12th of August, in front of a group of his passionate supporters in Altoona, Pennsylvania, Trump said this.
She can't beat what's happening here. The only way they can beat it, in my opinion, and I mean this 100%, if in certain sections of the state, they cheat, okay?
Huh. Cheating. That is definitely a bold claim to make. It wasn't substantiated, there was no evidence provided, but the message was undeniable. If I lose, it's because crooked Hillary cheated. Now obviously, these comments drew heavy criticism from just about everyone you can think of, but for Trump, that didn't really matter. For the remaining 88 days of his campaign, these baseless claims of a rigged election would become a prominent part of his strategy.
First of all, it's rigged. And I'm afraid the election's going to be rigged, I have to be honest.
We're competing in a rigged election. This is a rigged election, folks, okay? This guy has 18, I have 9. I wanted to say, no, well, he didn't. No, well, that's the way the system works. I said, well, then it's a rigged system.
The election is being rigged by corrupt media, pushing completely false allegations and outright lies in an effort to elect her president. They said, there's no way we're 3 down. Even the polls are crooked, I'm telling you. Look, we're in a rigged system, folks. We're in a rigged system.
In mid-October, with his chance of winning now at just 7%, Trump would take to his favorite social media platform to spread these baseless allegations even further. Hillary Clinton should have been prosecuted and should be in jail. Instead, she is running for president in what looks like a rigged election. Of course, there is large-scale voter fraud happening on and before Election Day. Why do Republican leaders deny what is going on? So naive. The election is absolutely being rigged by the dishonest and distorted media pushing crooked Hillary, but also at many polling places. Sad. Again, there was literally zero proof to support any of these claims, but as far as Trump was concerned, it was working fantastically because his supporters were actually starting to doubt the democratic process. In fact, during the final presidential debate on October 19th, Chris Wallace would ask Trump if he would unequivocally accept the result of the election, and this is how he responded.
I will look at it at the time. I'm not looking at anything now, I'll look at it at the time.
Wow. That doesn't inspire much confidence. Were we seriously heading towards a situation where a presidential nominee would outright reject the results of an election? When Al Gore lost in 2000 by a heartbreaking margin of 0.009% in Florida, he still got on stage and graciously conceded to Bush once the results were finalized. But do we really think Trump is the type of person to do that? Even with Hillary on track for a commanding 320 electoral votes, how far would Donald Trump go to undermine her victory? I guess only time would tell, but come election day, something weird happened.
Right now, a historic moment. We can now project the winner of the presidential race. CNN projects Donald Trump wins the presidency.
What started off as unlikely, impossible, is now reality.
In one of the single greatest upsets in American political history, Trump won the 2016 election. Even though he lost the popular vote by almost 3 million, he outperformed Hillary in key battleground states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan for a total of 306 electoral votes. After months spent undermining the nation's trust in the electoral process, those concerns had all but evaporated because, well, Trump was now the president-elect. As Tiger Woods once famously put it, winning takes care of everything, so the backup plan was never needed. But with all that in mind, what would Trump have done if things went a little differently? What if those battleground states with extremely thin margins went the other way? What if the Americans who stayed at home, assuming Hillary was a guaranteed win, actually mobilized and went out to vote? You know, what if Trump lost the election and that backup plan was the only plan? So, before we can go anywhere near the attack which occurred on January 6th, we first need to understand the timeline of events which preceded it, and trust me, that is a very long timeline. As I'm sure you're aware, violent rioters don't tend to materialize out of thin air and attack the Capitol on their own. No. To be convinced of something like that, it takes a continual stream of lies and deception, preferably from the single most powerful man in the world. So, with that in mind, let's rewind exactly 1 year to January of 2020, aka the place where this all starts. The first 3 years of Trump's presidency have been tumultuous, to say the very least, but going into year 4, he was actually in a strong spot for re-election. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, but firstly, and most importantly, the economy was booming. Unemployment was low at just 3.6%, the stock market was surging, and consumer confidence was nearing an all-time high. If the line is going up, voters are probably happy. Now, secondly, he beat the case. In late December, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Trump over the whole Biden-Ukraine scandal. For the sake of brevity, we won't open that can of worms, but he was ultimately acquitted by the Senate in early February. Given how serious the allegations were, you'd probably expect this to hurt Trump in the long run, but no actually. The exact opposite happened. To a lot of Americans, the impeachment felt like a partisan witch hunt to take down the president, and this completely backfired on Democrats. This can be seen in the fact that Trump's approval rating actually increased to an all-time high of 49% shortly after his acquittal. And finally, as a little cherry on top, Trump was the incumbent. Only 4 presidents had lost their re-election bid in the past century, which meant history was on his side. I'm not gonna lie, there was a lot for Trump to feel confident about going into an election year, and barring some catastrophic global event which would bring the entire world to its knees, another 4 years in the White House was certainly on the table.
Good evening, and it's great to have you with us here on a Thursday night, and we begin with that new case, the first human-to-human case of the coronavirus here in the U.S.
The coronavirus cases have risen to more than 7,800 worldwide, including 170 deaths.
Today, the World Health Organization declaring a global health emergency.
Yeah, you knew what was coming. In December 2019, there was an outbreak of novel coronavirus in Wuhan, China, and by the end of January, the disease had already reached American shores. Early reports suggested that it was highly infectious, it caused pneumonia-like symptoms, and, in the worst cases, it could turn deadly. By February 1st, the disease had already killed something like 300 people in China, with more than 14,000 confirmed cases. Experts warned that it was only a matter of time until there was a similar outbreak in the United States, and it would undoubtedly require a strong government response. This was certainly not the news Trump was hoping for going into an election year. He was riding a strong wave of support, and this disease looked as though it was about to unravel all the progress he'd made with the American public. But look, let's not forget something here. National emergencies are what define great leaders. In the same way that Lincoln had the Civil War, FDR had the Great Depression, and Clinton had his own promiscuity, COVID looked as though it was going to be the defining challenge of Trump's presidency. If he could successfully guide the country through an unprecedented global pandemic, not only would that cement his legacy in the history books, it'd also look pretty good to voters come November. So, as long as he stayed level-headed, assembled a team of good advisors, and listened to the experts, America could come out of this even stronger. Unfortunately, Donald Trump did not accomplish any of those 3 things. Nowadays, when people are polled on how well different countries responded to the pandemic, you'll usually find the United States sitting somewhere towards the bottom, and for good reason. Trump completely botched his handling of COVID from its very inception all the way to his last day in office. On February 26th at a White House press conference, Trump would tell reporters this.
And again, when you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to 0, that's a pretty good job we've done.
That's right, there were only 15 cases of COVID in the country, and, according to Donald, they're about to vanish because, well, why not? But strangely enough, the amount of cases in America would actually increase to 1,600 by mid-March. 2 weeks after that, it would increase to 163,000, and by the end of April, just 9 weeks after the first confirmed case in Seattle, there were more than 1 million people with COVID in the United States, and 63,000 people had been killed. Perhaps a slightly short-sighted prediction from the president. Most infamously, on April 26th, Trump would recommend this to the American public.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
Wow. nothing captures the absurdity of this moment better than the reaction of Dr. Birx, the coordinator of the coronavirus task force, who just sits there in absolute shock and horror as the most powerful man in the world claims that injecting disinfectant could cure COVID. Truly beyond parody. Now, you might be thinking, surely people weren't stupid enough to actually go and do this, but you'd be dead wrong. The amount of accidental poisonings with household disinfectants increased 121% after Trump made these comments compared to April of 2019. He later went on to claim that it was a sarcastic question, but even if we were to be charitable, why the fuck are you making a joke like that in the midst of a pandemic? By June, COVID had already killed tens of thousands of people, the economy had come to a grinding halt, and most Americans were trapped inside their homes. At a time like this, you'd hope that the president was doing everything in his ability to get the country back on track, but unfortunately, you'd once again be dead wrong. For Trump, his attention had shifted to one thing and one thing only. When could he start campaigning again? Seriously, to quote Chris Christie, one of Trump's closest advisors at this time, he was just beside himself. All he could think about was the campaign. He didn't talk much about anything else. COVID would come into it, but really, his focus was on the campaign. Nothing highlights this more than when Trump pushed to have an indoor campaign rally in Tulsa on June 20th, despite the fact his entire coronavirus task force advised against it. A lot of states had outright banned large indoor gatherings at this point because they were a hotspot for potential outbreaks, but come on, it had been over 3 months since his last rally, and he was itching to get back out there. On Twitter, Trump's campaign manager bragged about selling 800,000 tickets for the rally, which was extremely impressive, but when June 20th actually rolled around, it was nothing short of a disaster. Photos from the rally showed empty seat after empty seat, in what was supposed to be a triumphant return to the campaign trail. As it turns out, K-pop fans and people on TikTok had trolled the president by ordering thousands of tickets with absolutely zero intention of attending. In fact, the Tulsa Fire Department estimated that only 6,200 supporters attended the rally when the arena had a capacity of 19,000. The optics of this were devastating on their own, but Trump somehow managed to make a bad situation even worse. 15 minutes after getting on stage, he would tell his passionate supporters this.
When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please. They test and they test. We got tests that people don't know what's going on. We got tests. We got another one over here.
Yeah, apparently America should slow down its COVID testing because the numbers were looking bad. That sounds like a highly effective strategy for dealing with a pandemic. And look, just as his advisors predicted, this rally had dire consequences. Herman Cain, who Trump had recommended for a seat on the Federal Reserve, wanted to show his support for the president, so he flew to Tulsa to attend this rally. He even tweeted a photo of himself in the crowd with other supporters who were all having a quote, fantastic time. However, in the days that followed, the 74-year-old would test positive for COVID. A few days after that, he was hospitalized, and on July 30th, Cain would die due to complications from COVID. One of the senior staffers in Trump's campaign team later told a reporter that, "We killed Herman Cain." Economists from Stanford would go on to release a study in October, which estimated that the 18 rallies held by Trump between June and the end of September resulted in more than 30,000 additional COVID infections and 700 deaths. Also, it's important to note, this study didn't account for the more than 40 rallies which Trump held between October and November, so the actual amount is likely many times higher. As Chris Christie said, Trump's priority was campaigning, and COVID was just a mere afterthought. A poll released in the middle of August showed that only 35% of voters approved Trump's handling of COVID versus 61% who disapproved. With numbers like that, it's safe to say that 2020 was going very poorly for Trump, and to make matters worse, there was a second crisis on the horizon.
Now to new reports of a controversial police stop that ended in a death, all caught on tape.
George Floyd repeatedly told the officers that he could not breathe after an officer knelt on his neck, pinning him to the ground during an arrest.
I can't breathe.
You're talking
fine.
Deep breath.
I can't breathe.
On the 25th of May, as America neared 100,000 deaths from COVID, a white police officer named Derek Chauvin killed a black man named George Floyd after kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes. Despite saying that he couldn't breathe over 20 times, and with bystanders urging the officer to stop, Derek Chauvin did not relent and is now serving a 22-year prison sentence for second-degree murder. This case of such blatant police brutality sparked mass protests across the United States, once again bringing the issue of systemic racism to the forefront of American politics. Look, he was already fumbling his response to COVID, but here was a perfect opportunity for him to make things right, to showcase his leadership, and to prove to the American public that he was the right man for the job.
And then again, an extraordinary line, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. The President of the United States. Brian, your thoughts?
That's definitely a comment you can make. You know, with protests erupting in more than 140 cities across the country, threatening to have people shot is a notoriously effective means of de-escalation. Behind the scenes, things didn't look good either, as Trump was absolutely furious about the chaos and what he saw as an inadequate response from state leaders, telling his closest advisors, "We look weak, we don't look strong." In Trump's view, this civil unrest was all a matter of optics, as he was solely concerned with how this instability was reflecting on his public image. During a phone call on how to manage the situation, Trump urged state leaders to dominate the protesters, terrorists is the language he used, or they were going to make everyone, quote, look like a bunch of jerks. There were no calls for calm and no lowering the temperature. For Trump, it was all about showing as much force as possible. This became clear on June 1st during a press conference at the Rose Garden when Trump issued this threat.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them. As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and the wanton destruction of property.
Towards the end of this press conference, Trump announced that he was going to pay his respects to St. John's Church in Lafayette Square, which had been damaged by protesters the night before. This seemed like a nice gesture, as this was a church every president since James Madison had attended, but what followed was one of the most infamous moments of Trump's presidency. As nearby protesters were being brutally dispersed with tear gas and rubber bullets, the president waddled on camera to do this. I don't think there's any combination of words which can adequately describe the absurdity of this moment. Why is he standing like that? Who holds a Bible like that? Why does he point and gesture for a reporter to be quiet like they're a toddler? And why does this 2 minutes feel like an eternity? After threatening to deploy the military to quash protesters, you decide to stage the most awkward photo op of all time? They didn't even alert church authorities that they planned to do this. Rather unsurprisingly, this sparked a complete frenzy. Religious leaders were shocked that the Bible was being used as a political prop. Biden tore into him at a press conference the next day. The media was relentless in their criticism, and it even split support amongst his evangelical base, which is how you know things were really bad. This was yet another blunder, putting Trump's incompetency on full display, which was only becoming more apparent as time went on. A poll released on the 9th of June showed that 65% of people thought that Trump's response to the protests had been, quote, more harmful than helpful. Now look, the reason I bring up all this stuff on COVID and the George Floyd protests is to make one thing abundantly clear. Trump was absolutely fucking his re-election odds, and I don't say that lightly. The strong position he found himself at the beginning of 2020 had all but evaporated by June. The economy was in free fall, hundreds of thousands of Americans were dying from COVID, he'd fumbled his response to the murder of George Floyd, and perhaps most importantly of all, people were just sick of Trump and his antics. Nothing made this clearer than his disastrous performance in the first presidential debate, where Trump couldn't help but insult and interrupt Biden at every available opportunity.
Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're a
to answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question is the question is
Justice,
the
radical
question.
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen,
As you may remember, they literally had to adopt new rules to mute microphones when the other person was talking because of how bad Trump's behavior was. When focus groups were polled afterwards, almost 70% reported that they felt annoyed, and only 17% felt informed, which was a complete embarrassment. In such a tiring year for all of America, people were sick of the insults, sick of the lying, and sick of the incivility. To quote Mitch McConnell, being Donald Trump was enough for Trump to lose in November. And look, the overwhelming disapproval Americans felt towards their president was no secret to Trump or his team, because they had been sounding the alarm bells as early as April 27th. That was the day their leading pollster, Tony Fabrizio, distributed a 3-page memo detailing how Trump was on track for a spectacular defeat in November if nothing changed. To quote from it directly, absent a miraculous 2-month recovery for the economy, or Biden literally imploding, there is little chance that we will find ourselves back in the position we were in February. Around this same time, Trump's campaign manager, Brad Parscale, directly told the president, in February, you were on track to win more than 400 electoral votes, but now you are losing ground everywhere. Additionally, on June 18th, Trump's favorite news network released a very alarming poll which showed Biden with a 12-point lead over the president. Now, you could argue that Trump had been in this exact same situation in 2016 when he was trailing Hillary in all the polls and still managed to emerge victorious, but trust me, there was zero chance that was happening again. That election had been basically every pollster's 9/11, and it led them to adjust how they operated to ensure more accurate results. So look, I say all of this to make one key point. Trump had a terrible 2020. He knew it, his team knew it, and the American people definitely knew it. Even if COVID never happened and he was able to maintain his momentum from the start of the year, Trump still would have been in for a massive challenge against Biden come November. Relative to Hillary, he had a lot more support amongst the white working class, which was a group the Democrats desperately needed to win back if they wanted any chance of success in 2020. He was also a political veteran, he had a history of working across the aisle, he was down to earth, and most importantly, he looked to be a source of stability after 4 years of, well, whatever Donald Trump was. As November 3rd grew closer and closer, a Biden victory seemed more and more likely, and Trump knew it. So, with the odds stacked against him, the president decided to pull a page out of his 2016 playbook, because if he wasn't going to win this thing legitimately, he was going to need a backup plan. In early April, just before his approval ratings started to fall off a cliff, Trump began the first stage of a new backup plan, and things were going to look a little different this time around. Back in 2016, when Trump first made his allegations of election fraud, there was no semblance of a coherent strategy. You know, he claimed that crooked Hillary and the Democrats were cheating and the entire system was rigged, but if you wanted any explanation further than that, you simply weren't going to get it. However, for this upcoming election, Trump would get a little more tactical. To undermine people's faith in the electoral process, he was going to target one very specific thing: mail-in ballots. You can see the first stages of this plan unfold at a press conference on April 7th, when Trump was asked a question about the upcoming Wisconsin election.
The mail ballots are corrupt, in my opinion, and they collect them and they get people to go in and sign them, and then they're forgeries in many cases. It's a horrible thing.
Then, the following day, Trump would go after mail-in ballots again, this time on Twitter. Republicans should fight very hard when it comes to statewide mail-in voting. Democrats are clamoring for it. Tremendous potential for voter fraud, and for whatever reason, doesn't work out well for Republicans. Then, one day after that, on April 9th, Trump would get borderline conspiratorial during a press conference.
Because you know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win. I won't stand for it.
Dumping thousands of votes? What the fuck was he talking about? These baseless claims were especially unusual because Trump himself had voted with a mail-in ballot for the 2018 midterm elections. But anyway, pushing that blatant hypocrisy to one side, why was Trump specifically targeting mail-in ballots? Well look, I don't want to give the man too much credit, but as far as destroying a democracy and overturning legitimate elections go, Trump had devised a pretty clever plan. Here's how it worked. If you decide to go to a polling station on election day and vote in person, it's ready to be counted as soon as that station closes. By contrast, if you decide to mail in your ballot, it requires a bit more work. The envelope has to be opened, there's a barcode inside which needs to be scanned, and that confirms that you're actually registered to vote and that you haven't already voted somewhere else in the election. Additionally, they also have to make sure that the signature on your ballot matches the one they have in their system. Once all of that is done, then a mail-in ballot can officially be counted, and as you can probably guess, that takes considerably more time than an ordinary in-person vote. Now, there are some states like Texas and Florida who do all of this preparation before election day so the mail-in ballots can be counted at the same time as the ordinary votes, but there are also states like Pennsylvania who don't do this. They have to open the envelopes, scan the barcodes, and match the signatures on election night itself, which means the results from the mail-in ballots take a lot more time to be processed. Now, because Trump was undermining the legitimacy of mail-in ballots by calling them fraudulent, he was essentially encouraging his supporters to vote in person on election day. By contrast, the Democrats were encouraging their supporters to vote via mail to minimize how many people were exposed to COVID. As you can probably guess, these two contradictory messages from the major parties had some rather predictable consequences. One poll released in late August showed that whilst only 20% of Trump supporters planned on voting via mail, almost 60% of Biden supporters did, aka 3 times as many, and that's a massive disparity. So, with those numbers in mind, that could lead to a situation in Pennsylvania where Trump jumps out to a massive initial lead on election night as his in-person votes are counted first, but as the night progresses and the Biden-dominated mail-in ballots are counted, you could see things start to shift the opposite way. This is a phenomenon which election experts call the red mirage or blue shift, and they were trying to warn people about this months in advance. Basically, people needed to be patient as it was unlikely that the result would be known on election night itself. Now, Trump and his team were fully aware that this might occur, and it's exactly what their strategy relied upon. Think about it. If you were some random Trump supporter who had no idea what the red mirage was or how the vote counting process actually worked, and you saw the president's lead evaporate from 700,000 on election night to 164,000 the next morning, you'd probably think that looks kinda dodgy. And on top of that, if the president had spent the past several months telling you day in and day out that mail-in ballots were fraudulent, well, you might actually think that Biden and the Democrats had stolen the election. This is the exact result which Trump was hunting for in the situation that he lost the election, and it's why he was about to relentlessly target mail-in ballots. On May 24th, Trump would tweet this: "The United States cannot have all mail-in ballots. It will be the greatest rigged election in history. People grab them from mailboxes, print thousands of forgeries, and force people to sign." 2 days later, on May 26th, Trump tweeted, "There is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent. Mailboxes will be robbed, ballots will be forged, and even illegally printed out and fraudulently signed." This would actually be the first ever tweet from Trump which Twitter flagged for misinformation, adding a little disclaimer which said, "Get the facts about mail-in ballots." In response, Trump said this: "Twitter is now interfering in the 2020 presidential election. They are saying my statement on mail-in ballots, which will lead to massive corruption and fraud, is incorrect, based on fact-checking by fake news CNN and the Amazon Washington Post." On June 22nd, with a little more passion, Trump would tweet, "Rigged 2020 election. Millions of mail-in ballots will be printed by foreign countries and others. It will be the scandal of our times." 2 hours later, his tirade would continue, "Because of mail-in ballots, 2020 will be the most rigged election in our nation's history, unless this stupidity is ended. We voted during World War I and World War II with no problem, but now they're using COVID in order to cheat by using mail-ins." On July 29th, Trump tweeted again, "With universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote? Question mark, question mark, question mark? Delaying the election? That was definitely a new one. He even mentioned it at a press conference the very next day.
I don't want to delay. I want to have the election. But I also don't want to have to wait for 3 months and then find out that the ballots are all missing and the election doesn't mean anything. That's what's going to happen, Steve. That's common sense. And everyone knows it. Smart people know it. Stupid people may not know it. And some people don't want to talk about it, but they know it."
Ah, yes. All those stupid election experts who have no idea what they're talking about. Now, you might be wondering, is there any grain of truth to what Trump is claiming here? Like, sure, he's definitely lying to some extent, but is there a possibility for mail-in ballots to be fraudulent? Well, the answer to that is yeah, actually. As with literally any form of voting, fraud is always a possibility. But the real question to be asking is whether or not it's significant enough to change results, and the answer to that was God, no. One investigation of American elections between 2000 and 2012 found just 491 cases of absentee ballot fraud out of billions of votes. On August 26th, the Trump-appointed elections commissioner, Ben Hovland, told the media that there had been, quote, "no real evidence when it came to voter fraud." And to top it all off, you also had the FBI telling reporters that there was, quote, "no evidence of any coordinated fraud schemes related to voting by mail." I mean, look, the picture was pretty fucking clear to anyone with a functioning brain, yet Trump pushed on with his lies anyway. In fact, as the year progressed, his rhetoric became increasingly absurd. On July 19th, in an interview with Fox News, Chris Wallace asked the president,
Can you give a direct answer? You will accept the election?
I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no, and I didn't last time either.
For reference, this was the first time a sitting US president had ever raised doubts over accepting the result of a legitimate election. Then, on August 24th, at the Republican National Convention in Charlotte, Trump would tell his supporters this.
And hopefully we have judges that are going to give it a fair call, because if they give it a fair call, we're going to win this election. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election. We're going to win this election.
At a rally in Nevada on September 13th, Trump told his supporters,
"They're going to be sending out 80 million ballots. And it's Democrats. They're trying to rig this election.
On the 17th of September, Trump tweeted, "There is a group of people, largely radical left Democrats, that want election mayhem. States must end this crazy mass sending of ballots. Also, a gift to foreign interference into our election. Stop it now before it is too late." On the 27th of September, at a press conference, Trump told the media,
In Wisconsin, 3 trays of mail containing absentee ballots were found in a ditch. They were thrown in a ditch. 3 trays, that's a lot.
For reference, this claim was investigated by the Wisconsin Board of Elections, and it turned out that there wasn't a single absentee ballot found in those trays. And look, I could go on and on here, but we'll leave it at one final example. On the 29th of September, in his first debate against Biden, aka the biggest stage possible, Trump would once again reiterate these baseless claims about fraudulent mail-in ballots.
They're sending millions of ballots all over the country. There's fraud. They found them in creeks. They found some with the name Trump, just happened to have the name Trump just the other day in a waste paper basket. They're being sent all over the place. They sent 2 in a Democrat area. They sent out 1,000 ballots. Everybody got 2 ballots. This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen.
Now, would you be surprised if I told you that every single claim he just made about election fraud was immediately debunked by fact checkers? They had an absolute field day in the aftermath of this debate because Trump could not help but regurgitate lie after lie after lie. But, unfortunately, it didn't really matter how wrong he was. Trump's relentless attack campaign on mail-in ballots had already undermined enough people's faith in the election process that there was going to be problems on November 3rd, no matter what the result ended up being, and that's exactly what he wanted all along. And look, you might think I'm speculating too hard here when it's impossible for us to know what Trump's true intentions were, but no. For anyone capable of rational thought, doubts like that should have been all but eradicated on November 1st when Jonathan Swan from Axios dropped this bombshell of an article. Scoop. Trump's plan to declare premature victory. To quote from it directly, President Trump has told confidants he'll declare victory on Tuesday night if it looks like he's ahead, according to 3 sources familiar with his private comments. That's even if the Electoral College outcome still hinges on large numbers of uncounted votes in key states like Pennsylvania. I don't think it gets clearer than that. Now, on top of that report, there were also leaked comments coming from Trump's advisors who were reiterating the exact same point. During a phone call on October 31st, Steve Bannon told a group of his Chinese business associates that,
and what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. But that doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. The Democrats, more of our people vote early that count. Theirs voted mail. And so they're going to have a natural disadvantage, and Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. So when you wake up Wednesday morning, it's going to be a firestorm.
Not gonna lie, it's kind of bizarre listening to somebody outline the president's step-by-step plan to defraud the American public in advance, but there it is, I guess. Also, on November 1st, you had one of Trump's outside political strategists, Roger Stone, who'd been found guilty of obstruction, witness tampering, and lying to Congress to protect Trump during the 2016 investigation into Russian election interference, tell members of the Proud Boys, yes, those Proud Boys,
I really do suspect it will still be up in the air. But when that happens, the key thing to do is to claim victory. Possession is 9/10 the law. No, we won. Fuck you. Sorry, over. We won. Yeah. You're wrong. Fuck you.
And finally, again on November 1st, Trump's campaign strategist, Jason Miller, directly told the media,
if you speak with many smart Democrats, they believe that President Trump will be ahead on election night, probably getting 280 electorals, somewhere in that range. And then they're going to try to steal it back after the election. We believe that we will be over 290 electoral votes on election night. So no matter what they try to do, what kind of hijinks or lawsuits or whatever kind of nonsense they try to pull off, we're still going to have enough electoral votes to get President Trump reelected.
Look, the writing was on the wall. Trump and his team knew that the vote would shift towards Biden as the night progressed, and they also knew that they could use this to their advantage. Trump would declare victory on election night whilst he was ahead, and before the dust had any chance of settling, he'd make the completely false claim that Biden was trying to steal his victory away from him. This is the plan they'd been fermenting for several months, and all America could do was wait. November 3rd, Election Day. To say there was a lot at stake here would be quite the understatement. Like, sure, I know everyone calls every election these days the most important one of our lifetime, but this one actually felt like it. More than 158 million people would go on to cast their ballot this year, aka the highest turnout as a percentage of the population since 1900. And look, going into this day, it was pretty damn clear who was supposed to win. Most polls were predicting Biden to get a comfortable 51% of the vote, and this would put him 8 points ahead of Trump, which is a ridiculously large margin. Even if every single undecided voter was actually a covert Republican, it still wouldn't be enough for him to win. And sure, we'd all seen how Trump was able to defy the odds in 2016, but a repeat of that felt very unlikely, especially in the context of 2020. At this point in the pandemic, there'd been 9.3 million cases of COVID and more than 230,000 deaths, and a lot of voters thought that the blood was on Trump's hands. Obviously, it would be a mistake to count him out entirely, but the Biden camp was quietly confident about their chances. But okay, that brings us to the election itself. For Biden to become president, he needed to win back the states which Trump had unexpectedly taken in 2016, such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Those margins had been razor thin against Hillary, less than 10,000 votes in some cases, and this time around, the polling looked really good for Biden. In Pennsylvania, he led by 5 points, in Wisconsin it was about 8 points, and in Michigan it was over 7 points. If Biden was able to flip these 3 states, which most pollsters were expecting he would, and if he could hold on to everything else that Hillary won in 2016, he'd only need 12 more electoral votes to win the presidency. So, that begs the question, what other states was Biden hoping to pick up? Well, there was real talk that he could flip Arizona, North Carolina, and maybe even Florida, where recent polls had shown that Trump was trailing by 3.3 points. As the third most valuable state in the whole country, being worth 29 electoral votes, a win there would all but guarantee a landslide Biden victory. However, as the polls closed and the votes started pouring in, things weren't looking as good as expected. Whilst Biden found himself with an initial lead in Florida, Trump would go on to dominate as the night progressed, not only winning the state, but doubling his margin of victory compared to 2016. There's also a similar story in North Carolina, where Biden's 1.5 point lead in the polls had turned into a 1.5 point deficit as Trump took another convincing lead. And then, perhaps most worryingly of all, polls had shown that Biden only trailed by half a percentage point in Ohio, yet at 11 p.m., Trump was leading by 8 points with most of the votes already counted. For reference, that means the polls were off by a factor of 16. These were definitely not the results which Biden and his team had been anticipating, which was a real cause for concern. As election night ticked on, and these Trump margins continued to solidify, one question began sprouting up in a lot of people's minds. Was 2016 seriously about to happen again? Had the pollsters completely fucked it for the second time in a row? Especially on the left-leaning networks like MSNBC and CNN, you could feel the growing uneasiness. Now sure, there hadn't been anything definitive yet, as there were still tens of millions of votes which needed to be counted, but regardless of that, these were simply not the commanding margins which Democrats had been hoping for going into election night. In fact, if things continued to chug along like they had been, there was a world where Trump wouldn't need his backup plan for a second time. But then, just before 11:30 p.m. on Fox News, something incredibly strange happened.
I don't want to start ticking these off yet, guys. I think it's too early. I haven't made a lot of calls in some of the states, so I'll refrain from that for now. But what is this happening here? Why is Arizona blue? Did we make a call in Arizona?
Well, let's see.
There's a check mark. Did our decision desk make it? Arizona, 11 electoral votes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, if that's the case, then guys, when we come back, we'll fill this in. If you lose Arizona, where do you win now?
Look, I just gotta say it. This moment was an absolute cinematic masterpiece from beginning to end. Between Bill Hemmer asking, "Why is Arizona blue?" like he's quoting that one meme from Breaking Bad.
Why are you blue? Ugh,
to the fact Arizona changes literally as he swaps screens, to Brett Baer looking utterly dumbfounded when it cuts to his reaction from the desk. Truly an all-time moment in election coverage history. But, if I'm being honest, these reactions were entirely warranted. Arizona was a state that Trump could not afford to lose if he wanted to be re-elected, and here was Fox News calling it for Biden before literally anybody else in the media. For reference, it wouldn't be until November 12th, aka 9 days after the election, that the other major networks would also call Arizona for Biden, so this was a very dramatic decision. As you can probably imagine, Trump did not take this news particularly well from his election party in the White House, and to quote directly from Betrayal by Jonathan Karl, Kushner called Trump upstairs in the residence to give him the bad news, and the call group went up to talk to a now infuriated president. Trump felt betrayed. What the hell was Fox doing? Trump didn't really see the network as a news organization, he expected it to support him because most of its viewers supported him. Jared, call Rupert, Trump told his son-in-law, referring to the 89-year-old Rupert Murdoch, who owned Fox News. And get Hope to call Lachlan, Trump told Kushner, referring to Hope Hicks, who had worked for Rupert Murdoch's son Lachlan and knew him well. They've got to change this, Trump shouted. It is incredibly revealing that Trump's first instinct in this situation was to call the guy who owns the network because he didn't like the decision their political analysts and math nerds came to after crunching the numbers. But anyway, despite the pressure coming from the president and his closest advisors who were quickly calling every executive at Fox they could get through to, this ultimately turned out to be the correct call. Biden would go on to win the state of Arizona by 0.4 percentage points, or just over 10,000 votes. This was a major turning point in the night, which injected a lot of optimism back into the Biden camp. Now, just to be clear, none of the networks were close to calling who had won the election at this point, but it was still a really positive sign. But anyway, 1 hour after Fox made this call, Biden would get on stage at 12:41 a.m. to deliver a very important speech.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election. We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it was going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished. And it ain't over till every vote is counted, every ballot is counted. But we're feeling good. We're feeling good about where we are.
This was the responsible thing to do. Biden hadn't outright declared victory, as that would have been a lie with the amount of votes left to be counted, but he did signal a healthy amount of optimism over the way things look to be going. This is good, and it's what you'd expect a presidential candidate to do.
Look, you know, we could know the results as early as tomorrow morning, but it may take a little longer. As I've said all along, it's not my place or Donald Trump's place to declare who's won this election. That's the decision of the American people. But I'm optimistic about this outcome.
Again, Biden was doing the responsible thing here, tempering people's expectations because there could still be days of counting ahead. Although this was a very short speech that only lasted a few minutes, the message from Biden was crystal clear. Nobody has won this election yet, but we are feeling pretty confident about our prospects. Unfortunately, this absolutely infuriated Donald Trump. At 12:44 a.m., before Biden had even finished speaking, Trump began lashing out on Twitter. "We are up big, but they are trying to steal the election. We will never let them do it. Votes cannot be cast after the polls are closed." Then, less than 1 minute after that, he added, "I will be making a statement tonight, a big win." That kind of sounds like the president is gonna declare victory. Despite the fact that no outlet had called the election, and none of them would until 4 days later on November 7th, Trump had apparently won big. Damn, if only we had several months of evidence pointing to the fact that he was always going to prematurely announce victory. And look, whilst those tweets were certainly bad, they wouldn't compare to what happened 2 hours later. From behind his lectern in the East Room, with a wave of American flags to his back, Trump would deliver one of the most dangerous speeches a US president ever has.
And all of a sudden, everything just stopped. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment, and we will win this, and as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it. So I just want to thank you.
Well, that was a slight change of pace from what Biden had said hours earlier, wasn't it? On the MSNBC broadcast of Trump's speech, they literally had to cut him off so Brian Williams could say this.
We are reluctant to step in, but duty-bound to point out when he says we did win this election, we've already won, that is not based in the facts at all. Again, there are millions of votes yet to be counted. Our presidents don't select our victors.
And I mean, yeah, they were completely within their right to do that. Nobody had won the election yet, and Trump himself knew that. His campaign manager, William Stepien, advised him that the results would not be known for some time and that he could not truthfully declare victory. In fact, every single one of Trump's advisors and closest associates who were at the White House election party agreed with that sentiment, except for one Rudy Giuliani, who was, quote, definitely intoxicated. Giuliani announced, to nobody in particular, it was time for the president to give a speech saying he had won the election. He should go out there and declare victory, Giuliani said to the group. If he doesn't, they will steal it from us. Nobody in the room took Giuliani's slurred words seriously, but he had been telling the president the same thing. Anyway, after Trump's rambling subsided, Mike Pence took the stage and said this.
While the votes continue to be counted, we're going to remain vigilant, as the president said. I truly do believe, as you do, that we are on the road to victory and we will make America great again.
You can just tell how careful he was trying to be with his language there. It was the road to victory, not victory itself, because Mike Pence lived in reality where the outcome of the election had not yet been determined. But anyway, there was only so much damage control Pence could do, as the election denial narrative, which Trump had been preparing for so long, was now officially rolling. And look, you only needed to take one glance at the election map to understand why Trump wanted the votes to stop. In Pennsylvania, he was ahead by 700,000 with just 30% of the vote left to be counted. If you knew nothing about the election, you'd assume that to be an inevitable Trump victory, but as we've explained in detail, this was the red mirage in full swing. Almost all of the remaining votes to be counted in Pennsylvania were sent via mail, and we knew that Biden had won 78% of the 500,000 mail-in ballots, which had already been counted. If that trend continued for the remaining 2.2 million votes, Biden would win Pennsylvania, and that is why he wanted all voting to stop. Look, no matter what happened, Americans were in for a very long week. Trump had finally put his plan to steal the election into motion, an outcome which a lot of people were unfortunately expecting, and that left one question as Americans went to bed. How far was Donald J. Trump willing to take this? The following morning, as vote counters were fulfilling their legal duty under immense social pressure, the President of the United States was losing his mind on Twitter. At 10:04 a.m., Trump would tweet this. "Last night I was leading, often solidly, in many key states, in almost all instances Democrat-run and controlled. Then, one by one, they started to magically disappear as surprise ballot dumps were counted. Very strange, and the pollsters got it completely and historically wrong. Then, 13 minutes later, at 10:17 a.m., how come every time they count mail-in ballot dumps, they are so devastating in their percentage and power of destruction? Just under 2 hours after that, they are finding Biden votes all over the place, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So bad for our country." And then, at 4:56 p.m., in what has to be one of my favorite Trump tweets from this entire saga, "We have claimed, for electoral vote purposes, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which won't allow legal observers, the state of Georgia, and the state of North Carolina, each one of which has a big Trump lead. Additionally, we hereby claim the state of Michigan, if, in fact, there was a large number of secretly dumped ballots, as has been widely reported." Sorry, what? You don't just get to call dibs on the states that you want to win, because funnily enough, that isn't how elections work in a democracy. But look, this response from Trump was hardly surprising. As states began to process more and more of the Biden-dominated mail-in ballots, the red mirage was finally starting to dissipate. In fact, just after 2 p.m., the Associated Press would call Wisconsin for Biden, and 4 hours after that, they would also call Michigan for him too. These crucial victories put him at 264 electoral votes, which was just 6 shy of the presidency. Obviously, this was not the news that Donald Trump wanted to be hearing, so the following morning on November 5th, he would once again take to Twitter. "Stop the count." Now, admittedly, this was a rather strange instruction. For one, it was totally illegal and the president had zero authority to stop the votes from being counted, and two, he was kinda shooting himself in the foot. I mean, sure, in Pennsylvania, where that 700,000 vote lead on election night had dwindled to just 100,000, he would win if counting stopped. However, in Arizona, a state where Biden still held a significant lead because they counted mail-in ballots first, well, Trump would all but guarantee himself a loss. This resulted in the absurd situation where you had protesters in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where Trump was ahead, chanting "Stop the count" at election facilities. Stop the count! Stop the count! And then, in Arizona, a state where Trump was behind, you had protesters chanting "Count the vote" at election facilities. Count the vote! Count the vote! Do you know how stupid that is? And worst of all, it didn't matter that this was a blatant logical inconsistency because Trump's base still ate it up. They had been drip-fed this completely fabricated narrative of election fraud for over half a year by their leader, and we were now seeing the consequences of it in real time.
The Biden crime family steals the election! The media is covering up! The Biden crime family steals this election! The media is covering up! The Biden crime family steals this election! The media is covering up. We want our freedom for the world. Give us our freedom, Joe Biden. Joe Biden is covering up this election. He's stealing it.
But look, as far-fetched as these claims of a stolen election were, Trump was still well within his right to pursue whatever legal challenges he wanted to. You know, if there really had been illegal votes dumped in the middle of the night, and election interference from the Democrats, he just had to go out there and prove it. Conduct the necessary investigations, gather the evidence, request recounts, and let the judicial system do its thing. If the courts proved him right on this, his prize would be another 4 years in the Oval Office, aka pure vindication. And look, that's exactly what he went and did. Trump's campaign team started pushing for recounts in states like Georgia and Wisconsin. They filed dozens of lawsuits all across the country and pursued every legal avenue they possibly could. I'm not gonna lie, they were mounting a serious challenge to the integrity of the election, but there was one small issue. It was complete bullshit. In a 2-month stretch between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021, the Trump campaign would file 62 separate lawsuits seeking to overturn the election, and out of those, only one would result in a victory for the president. One. Additionally, that single win they got in a Pennsylvania court only affected a tiny fraction of votes and didn't disqualify anywhere near enough to change the final outcome. A 1.6% success rate on your lawsuits is embarrassing enough, but when you actually go case by case and read what the judges were saying, it quickly gets even more embarrassing. Just look at this. In Arizona, for example, the plaintiffs in Boyer v. Ducey alleged that the election was tainted by the introduction of hundreds of thousands of illegal, ineligible, duplicate, or purely fictitious ballots. A federal judge dismissed their suit, finding it void of plausible allegations and sorely wanting of relevant or reliable evidence. In Georgia, a state court dismissed Boland v. Raffensperger, which alleged that tens of thousands of illegal ballots were cast by out-of-state voters or with invalid signature matches. The judge found that the complaint's factual allegations rest on speculation rather than duly pled facts and do not support a conclusion that sufficient illegal votes were cast to change or place in doubt the results of the election. In Michigan, a federal judge found in King v. Whitmer that the plaintiffs' claims of massive election fraud were based on nothing but speculation and conjecture that votes for President Trump were destroyed, discarded, or switched to votes for Vice President Biden. And in Constantino v. City of Detroit, the plaintiffs' allegations of widespread vote counting fraud were ruled by a judge to be speculative, filled with guesswork, and often unsubstantiated, and this decision was upheld by the Michigan Court of Appeals and the Michigan Supreme Court too. And look, for those of you who think this is just a corrupt justice system at work, 22 of these cases had judges which were appointed by Republican presidents, 10 of the cases had judges appointed by Trump himself, and of the cases which almost reached the Supreme Court, all 3 of the judges appointed by Trump rejected the claims of fraud. It really doesn't get any more damning than that. Ultimately, all of the legal avenues pursued by the Trump campaign would prove to be dead ends. No lawsuit would discover thousands of illegally dumped votes, and all of these subsequent recounts would only bolster Biden's lead in the states that they occurred. Simply put, there hadn't been any systematic fraud in the 2020 election. And so, that brings us to November 7th, where just before midday, the Associated Press would finally make the call which everyone had been waiting for.
We can now project the winner of the presidential race. CNN projects Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States, winning the White House and denying President Trump a second term.
Biden had actually done it. He beat Donald Trump. Sure, it wasn't in the dominant fashion which the polls were predicting and Democrats were hoping for, but it was a win nonetheless. Election analysts could finally make this call after Biden won the state of Pennsylvania, as that 700,000 vote lead which Trump held on election night ultimately turned into an 80,000 vote deficit once all the mail-in ballots were counted. Biden would release a celebratory video, Kamala Harris would make an infamous phone call, and a new chapter was ready to start in the United States of America. Just before the Associated Press would call the election for Biden, it turned out that something was brewing in the Trump camp. At 9:35 a.m., the president would issue this announcement. Lawyers' press conference at Four Seasons, Philadelphia, 11 a.m. Interesting. The Trump team had an important update to give on the election from a very luxurious venue. I mean, hell, just look at what the Four Seasons website has to say about their Philly conference rooms. From the boardroom to the ballroom, our function rooms are modern, elegant, and flexible. Book the entire 5th floor for a high-level conference, host a private dinner for colleagues at Vernick Fish, or invite clients for a power breakfast above the clouds on the 59th floor. Wow, talk about extravagant. I wonder which room the Trump team were going to book. Would they prefer the beautiful skyline views for this announcement, or the functionality of the bigger room downstairs? Whatever though, I guess it isn't the most pressing matter given all the supposed election fraud they have to talk about, and I'm sure whatever room they picked would be nice either way. However, 10 minutes later, Trump would delete his first tweet and issue a slight addendum. Big press conference today in Philadelphia at Four Seasons Total Landscaping. 11:30 a.m. Sorry, what? Give me a sec. Four Seasons Total Landscaping. Okay, we'll drag and drop. We'll turn, and oh my god. No way. Did the Trump team seriously book the wrong 4 seasons? Instead of some luxurious hotel room, were they about to host one of the most important press conferences of this campaign in some dingy back alleyway in an industrial precinct which was more than 8 miles away from the Philadelphia CBD? Well, the answer to that question was yes. They were going to give this update at a venue crammed between a crematorium and a sex shop. What a completely disastrous blunder for a completely disastrous campaign team. Because there was no time to book a new venue and reschedule the press conference, the Trump team simply had to make do. They desperately taped a series of campaign signs to the garage door to make things somewhat presentable, but I mean, come on. The idea of polishing a turd comes to mind here. On top of that, it really seemed like the universe wanted to make the Trump team look as stupid as possible because 10 minutes before Rudy Giuliani would begin speaking here, Fox News officially called the election for Biden. Under ordinary circumstances, that would be game over for a political campaign, but unfortunately, these were far from ordinary circumstances. So, at 11:30 a.m., in some random parking lot, Rudy Giuliani would begin his conspiracy theory-ridden tirade on how the election was stolen.
Instead of going to a high degree of care to allow inspections of the mail-in ballots, there was no inspection of a single mail-in ballot. Those mail-in ballots could have been for anybody they wrote in. Those mail-in ballots could have been written the day before by the Democratic Party hacks that were all over the convention center. I know this city has a sad history of voter fraud. After all, Joe Frazier is still voting here. Kind of hard since he died 5 years ago. Also, Will Smith's father has voted here twice since he died. I don't know how he votes because his vote is secret. This is outrageous. In an enormously important contest with a very, very suspect method of voting, there was no security. Zero. The people of this city, people of this country have no assurance at all that those ballots were actually cast. They would have to have been almost unanimously cast for Joe Biden in order to catch up. And there can be only one conclusion as to why you would make it so impossible. Because many, many of them were fraudulent. And you just don't lose leads like that without corruption. And you're in a city in which voter fraud is professional. What was it called by? Oh my goodness, all the networks. Wow. All the networks. We have to forget about the law. Judges don't count. All the networks thought Biden was going to win by 10%. Gee, what happened?
A rather interesting press conference. Now, you're probably wondering, were any of Giuliani's claims here true? No, of course not. Joe Frazier had not voted in any election after his death. That was an outright lie. In the case of Will Smith's father, he did actually vote after dying in 2016, but there's a very clear explanation to this. He mailed in his absentee ballot, as was totally legal for him to do, but ended up passing away one day before the 2016 election occurred. Now, if you take a look at the election code from that year, a ballot like this is still considered to be legitimate, so it's entirely legal for it to be counted. I can partially understand if you have a problem with that rule, because it's a bit of a strange grey area where you're obviously alive when you casted your vote, but you're dead once it's being counted, but regardless of that, this is clearly a very niche technical issue, not some shadowy case of fraud like Giuliani was presenting it to be. Next, Giuliani also claimed that ballots weren't properly inspected in Pennsylvania. Was that true? Nope. Their Supreme Court rejected this case in a 5-2 decision as they found the observation process to be entirely legal. And finally, when it came to those fraudulent mail-in ballots, Giuliani had not produced a modicum of evidence to support his claims. Simply put, these allegations were completely nonsensical, just like everything else to do with this fucking insane press conference. After it wrapped up, Giuliani was rather unsurprisingly torn to shreds by the media. He became a complete national laughingstock for the venue mix-up, and after such an embarrassment, you'd probably expect him to be relegated or dropped from the Trump team entirely, but you'd be dead wrong. In fact, once the networks had officially called the election for Biden, Giuliani would actually ascend to a new level of power within the Trump aristocracy. By November 14th, he was no longer just the president's personal attorney, he was now the head of his entire campaign legal team. And look, just to be very clear, this is where the story really starts to go off the deep end. As Trump would lose lawsuit after lawsuit, and the prospect of overturning the election in a legal manner became increasingly unlikely, the president would start to depend on a new group of people in the White House. They weren't very experienced, their credentials were flimsy at best, and their theories were absolutely outlandish, but they told Donald Trump everything he wanted to hear. So, with that being said, I think it's time we meet Team Crazy. For a little bit of context here, Trump's inner circle was initially filled with semi-reasonable people. This included the likes of Bill Stepien, his campaign manager, Mark Meadows, the White House Chief of Staff, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, and even family members like Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner. Now, don't get me wrong, these people are all far from perfect and each deserve a lot of criticism in their own right. However, at the very least, they mostly operated in reality. You know, none of these people got up whilst intoxicated to tell the president that he should falsely declare victory on election night when the result was still unknown. I know that isn't a high bar to clear, but for Trump's inner circle, it actually kinda is. Now, because this group at least partially existed in reality, and they weren't seeing any actual evidence surface to support Trump's claims of election fraud, they in turn grew doubtful that there was any. This is something that reasonable people do. They see a claim, they weigh it up against the evidence, and when it turns out that there is no evidence, they call bullshit. Unfortunately though, exercising your capacity for reason wasn't a very pragmatic thing to be doing if you were trapped in the depths of Trump's inner circle. He was absolutely determined to overturn the result of the election by any means necessary, and he needed a group of people who would join him in that effort. Therefore, as the days and weeks would go on, the president would come to rely on a new group of advisors, aka the aforementioned Team Crazy. This was a band of Trump fanatics who were entirely convinced that the election had been stolen from him and were searching far and wide to prove that fact. This operation was led by Rudy Giuliani, who we just met, and he recruited a team of lawyers and investigators to help him on this crusade. This included people like Sidney Powell, someone we will become intimately familiar with very shortly, Jenna Ellis, Michael Flynn, and John Eastman. To be clear, this was a deeply conspiratorial collection of individuals who Trump insiders would later refer to as a kitchen cabinet of idiots, or simply the clown car. Now, you might be wondering, how did this group garner such lovely nicknames? Well, to answer that, let's take a look at what Sidney Powell had to say during an interview with Fox News on November 8th.
There has been a massive and coordinated effort to steal this election from we the people of the United States of America, to delegitimize and destroy votes for Donald Trump, to manufacture votes for Joe Biden. They have done it in every way imaginable, from having dead people vote in massive numbers to absolutely fraudulently creating ballots that exist only voting for Biden. They also used an algorithm to calculate the votes they would need to flip. We have got to fight tooth and nail in federal court to expose this abject fraud and the conspiracy behind it, and get a recount and audits in every place it's needed, which is frankly most of the country. They had this all planned, Maria. They had the algorithms, they had the paper ballots waiting to be inserted if and when needed, and notably President Trump's vote in the blue states went up enormously. That's when they had to stop the vote count and go in and replace votes for Biden and take away Trump votes. And when the votes are really audited and the real votes are counted, Trump will win. He is the president and he is in charge of this country.
Yeah, this is what we're going to be dealing with. Also, shout out to Fox News for platforming this nutter. I'm sure that won't come back to bite them whatsoever. Anyway, from this point forward, Sidney Powell and the rest of Team Crazy would start to peddle a lot of conspiratorial bullshit to the American people. In fact, there are so many theories that it would be impossible to cover them all, but if I had to boil it down to the three most important ones, there'd be 1, the ineligible voters, 2, Dominion voting machines, and 3, the suitcases of ballots in Georgia. So, why don't we take a look at them in more detail. First up, the ineligible voters. This is a pretty broad category which refers to a whole range of conspiracy theories, including dead voters, underage voters, ballot dumps in the middle of the night, and everything like that. We've already heard from Giuliani how Joe Frazier and Will Smith's father were apparently able to vote whilst not being alive, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. To get a better idea, why don't we listen to some very wise words from the president in an interview he gave with Fox.
And what happened, if you watched the election, I was called by the biggest people saying, congratulations, political people. Congratulations, sir, you just won the election. It was 10 o'clock and you looked at the numbers, and I'm sure you felt that way. This election was over. And then they did dumps. They call them dumps, big, massive dumps in Michigan and Pennsylvania. and all over.
That's right. There were big, massive dumps happening all across the country. One of the most prominent examples of this, which conspiracy theorists still love to cite by the way, supposedly occurred at a counting station in the TCF Center in Detroit. In the early hours of the morning after election night, footage can be seen of a white van entering the TCF Center's loading bay, parking, then dropping off several boxes of ballots, which are then brought inside. Then, later that morning, a GOP consultant posted this screenshot to Twitter, which showed that Biden had gained 140,000 votes in Michigan, i.e. the state which Detroit and the TCF Center is in, at the same time that Trump had gained, well, 0. You can see his votes stay at exactly 2.2 million, whilst Biden's skyrockets. This tweet from the consultant would then be amplified by the Antichrist himself, Matt Walsh, and the president would also retweet it too, saying, "What is this all about?" Then, to make matters even worse, there were also some election peculiarities going on at the same time in neighboring Wisconsin. The polling site 538 posted this graph showing how the count had progressed in the state overnight, and oh, that's a suspiciously vertical jump in votes for Biden, isn't it? Now, if we take all of these separate incidents and mash them together, well, you can probably see why conspiracy theorists were frothing at the mouth, because this all looked pretty dodgy. I mean, hell, if we go back to that van footage for a second, just look at how OAN was explaining the situation to their viewers. Van escorted by car in official capacity appears to deliver 60 boxes of fake Biden ballots. The situation ended up getting so bad that protests would erupt outside the TCF Center in the days after the election. Now, whilst all of this looks pretty suspect on first inspection, the second you decide to go deeper into any of these incidents is the second you discover a reasonable explanation for literally everything. Firstly, let's tackle the footage. As we've mentioned, this so-called ballot dump occurred at the TCF Center in Detroit, which is located in Wayne County, aka the single most populous county in all of Michigan, with more than 662 individual voting precincts. To count the massive amounts of votes here, they do things a little differently compared to other counties, as Jonathan Karl explains in his book, Betrayal. In every other county, they count the ballots at the precinct, but in Wayne County, they bring them into one central counting place, aka the TCF Center. So the boxes are coming in all night. The fact that boxes are coming in, well, that's what they do. Nothing unusual or illegal. The ballots are turned in at the precincts by 8 PM and then transported in boxes to the place where they are counted. So, right off the bat, this wasn't some illegal ballot dump. The van was simply transporting completely legitimate votes from a Wayne County precinct to the TCF Center, which is where all the counting happened. So far, so good. Next, those 140,000 votes which all went to Biden, well, it turns out that was just a case of human error, as someone inputting data from a particular county literally just made a typo. And Abby Bowen, elections clerk in Shiawassee County, told us by phone that the error came down to a typo. There was a typo in the initial report that went out to the Bureau of Elections. It was caught in a very short amount of time and quickly corrected, Bowen said. There was an extra zero added on the end when Biden's votes were keyed in. The firm responsible for updating the electoral map, Election Desk HQ, were also fully transparent about the mistake, posting this update to Twitter and promptly fixing it. Also, the GOP consultant who initially posted the screenshot, which both Trump and Walsh amplified, did the principled thing once he heard this explanation and deleted his tweet. He was right to point out the discrepancy in the first place and to bring attention to it, but once the truth was revealed, he got rid of it. Now, the final thing to address is that graph in Wisconsin. Again, it does look suspicious, but once you start digging into things, it actually makes a lot of sense. To directly quote an article written by Haley Miller for PolitiFact, Democratic nominee Joe Biden passed Trump in Wisconsin at about 3:30 a.m. on November 4th because the city of Milwaukee reported its 170,000 absentee votes, aka mail-in votes, all at the same time. The votes were reported together because Milwaukee and 38 other communities use a central count location. Other communities counted absentee ballots at the polling places and reported them earlier along with their in-person vote totals. From 3:26 to 3:44 a.m. in the Associated Press election reporting stream, the vote for Biden jumped by 149,520 and Trump's vote jumped by 31,803 votes. So, if we do the maths, that means 18% of those votes were for Trump and 82% were for Biden, which is a very stark margin, but it should make a lot of sense. For one, those 170,000 votes were all mail-in ballots being counted, which, as we know, slanted very heavily towards Biden. On a national level, just 1/3 of mail-in ballots went to Trump, whereas 2/3 went to Biden. Now, secondly, almost all of these ballots were coming from Milwaukee, which is a very urban county, and they tend to lean heavily Democratic as well. For example, in the Republican stronghold that is Texas, there are still urban counties like Travis, where Austin is located, that voted 71% for Biden and only 26% for Trump. This is just how things tend to go in major cities. So sure, this massive leap does look pretty strange, but when you understand it was all coming from the most populous urban county in the entire state that was reporting all of its mail-in ballots at the same time, it does become a lot more understandable. As I said initially, all three of these incidents had perfectly reasonable explanations. And look, this is basically how it goes for any of the conspiracy theories involving the so-called ineligible voters. Trump and his team of crazies would make similarly absurd allegations about out-of-state voters in Nevada, 70,000 underage voters in Georgia, and 20,000 dead voters in Pennsylvania. They sound shocking upon first inspection, but after doing like 2 minutes of research, the entire house of cards starts to topple down because, well, they're bullshit. Now, the second major conspiracy theory being pushed by Team Crazy centered around the voting machines being used all across the country by a company formerly known as Dominion Voting Systems. This is something Sidney Powell mentioned in her interview with Fox News, but basically, according to her, the software in these machines were flipping votes from Trump to Biden. By November 12th, this theory had already reached the president as he tweeted out a quote from a report that claimed Dominion machines had deleted 2.7 million Trump votes nationwide. Now, I must admit that this was a very strange claim for the president to be amplifying. On that very same day, there had been an internal memo from the Trump campaign which declared that Dominion software did not lead to improper vote counts and concluded that these machines had no effect on the final outcome of the election. Jason Miller, one of Trump's closest advisors, would also testify that he directly told the president about this analysis by November 12th, calling the allegations against Dominion, quote, not valid. And look, this is a pattern which you'll notice with Trump during this stretch of time. No matter how much his inner circle disproved these outlandish theories in private, the president would still relentlessly promote them to the public, almost as if he had no regard for the actual truth. In addition to that memo, the Department of Homeland Security would also release a statement that day, claiming that the 2020 election was the most secure one in American history. They also went out of their way to bold a certain line later in the press release, which read, "There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised." Now, you would hope that would send a pretty clear message to the president and Team Crazy to stop making these insane allegations, but no, they'd only double down. On November 17th, Chris Krebs, the cyber chief at the Department of Homeland Security, would issue this innocuous tweet, which simply reaffirmed the consensus amongst election security experts, i.e., there had been no credible evidence of fraud thus far. However, there was one man that would take issue with this tweet, and unfortunately for Krebs, that man happened to be the single most powerful person on the entire planet. Hours later, Trump would tweet this. The recent statement by Chris Krebs on the security of the 2020 election was highly inaccurate in that there were massive improprieties and fraud, including dead people voting, poll watchers not allowed into polling locations, glitches in the voting machines which changed votes from Trump to Biden, late voting, and many more. Therefore, effective immediately, Chris Krebs has been terminated as director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. What a totally normal response from the President of the United States. And actually, speaking of things which are totally normal, let's take a look at something which happened 2 days later on November 19th. This is when Giuliani and Sidney Powell decided to host a press conference in the nation's capital, and there really isn't any context I can give you to preempt what you're about to hear, so let's just have a listen.
What we are really dealing with here and uncovering more by the day is the massive influence of communist money through Venezuela, Cuba, and likely China in the interference with our elections here in the United States. The Dominion voting systems, the Smartmatic technology software, and the software that goes in other computerized voting systems here as well, not just Dominion, were created in Venezuela at the direction of Hugo Chavez to make sure he never lost an election after one constitutional referendum came out the way he did not want it to come out.
Yep, that's right. These voting machines were manufactured at the behest of Hugo Chavez, the former socialist president of Venezuela, who had been dead for 7 years, to undermine the integrity of American elections. Seriously, what the fuck was she talking about? This was bordering on some QAnon, Hillary Clinton is drinking the blood of children levels of conspiracy theory. Also, when Dominion later sued both Giuliani and Sidney Powell for defamation with these bullshit allegations they were making, her lawyers would make the defense, and I kid you not, that quote, no reasonable person could have mistaken these claims about Hugo Chavez voting machines as statement of fact. Just utterly insane. Anyway, the media obviously took a keen interest in these far-fetched allegations which Sidney Powell was making, but it would be Rudy Giuliani who actually got the most attention after this press conference. You see, for close to 40 minutes, he would embark on a genuinely deranged rant about how the election was stolen, and this in turn made him very sweaty. This resulted in a series of now infamous images where the very impassioned 76-year-old has his eyes bulging, his tongue partially out, and there's a mysterious black liquid, likely his hair dye, dripping down the side of his cheek. Unfortunately for Giuliani, no sane person with a reasonable point to make has ever been photographed looking like this as they pled their case. But okay, going back to Powell for a moment, her claims about Dominion voting machines were so batshit crazy that even Tucker Carlson was skeptical of them. Keep in mind, this is a man from a network which was about to be relentlessly sued for all of the misinformation and lies they spread about the election during this point in time, and even they had some pause about the nonsense which was coming out of Sidney Powell's mouth.
So we invited Sidney Powell on the show. We would have given her the whole hour. We would have given her the entire week, actually, and listened quietly the whole time at rapt attention. That's a big story. But she never sent us any evidence, despite a lot of requests, polite requests, not a page. When we kept pressing, she got angry and told us to stop contacting her. When we checked with others around the Trump campaign, people in positions of authority, they told us Powell has never given them any evidence either, nor did she provide any today at the press conference. Powell did say that electronic voting is dangerous, and she's right, we're with her there. But she never demonstrated that a single actual vote was moved illegitimately by software from one candidate to another. Not one.
Put simply, there was zero evidence to back up the preposterous claims that Powell was making. When one of her lawsuits against Dominion and their voting machines reached a Michigan court in early December, the judge noted how no proof was actually given that any votes were flipped, and instead, Powell's legal team had only brought, quote, an amalgamation of theories, conjecture, and speculation that such alterations were possible. I hope it goes without saying, but that case was dismissed. Ultimately, Dominion's voting machines were completely fine. No evidence ever emerged showing a single case of fraud, cheating, or rigging. In fact, Dominion would have the last laugh in all of this as they would go on to sue Fox News, Newsmax, One American News, Sidney Powell, and Rudy Giuliani for all of the lies they intentionally spread about the company. Fox would settle for almost $800 million, Newsmax settled for, $67 million, and the other settlements were not disclosed to the public. Generally, you don't have to cough up huge sums of money like that unless you were really fucking wrong about something. Now, the final conspiracy theory we're going to cover is a specific incident which occurred in Fulton County, Georgia. On December 3rd, Rudy Giuliani and his legal team would present a highly edited video from a polling station on election night to Georgia state lawmakers during a hearing on election integrity.
So now they're going to start pulling these ballots out from under this table. This table, the black one, was placed there by the lady with the blonde braids at about 8:22 a.m. in the morning. So she put that table there. So the same person who's staying behind now, the same person who cleared the place out under the pretense that we're going to stop counting, is the person who put the table there at 8:22 in the morning. Yeah, I saw 4 suitcases come out from underneath the table. So what are these ballots doing there, separate from all the other ballots? And why are they only counting them whenever the place is cleared out with no witnesses?
Then, later on this hearing, Giuliani would draw some pretty serious conclusions from this footage.
And when you look at what you saw on the video, which to me was a smoking gun, powerful smoking gun, well, I don't have to be a genius to figure out what happened. And I don't have to be a genius to figure out that those votes are not legitimate votes. You don't put legitimate votes under a table.
No.
Wait until you throw the opposition out, and in the middle of the night, count them. We would have to be fools to think that.
And, as a nice little cherry on top, Giuliani would issue this tweet later that night. The videotape doesn't lie. Fulton County Democrats stole the election. It's now beyond doubt. Go to the tape. So, from Giuliani's perspective, This footage showed a coordinated operation in which election observers were forced to leave the room so that fake Biden ballots could be pulled out from underneath the table and counted to rob Trump of a victory in Georgia. However, there was one problem with this interpretation of events. It was bullshit. First of all, those were not suitcases being pulled out from underneath the table. To quote Matthew Mashburn, the chairman of the state election board in Georgia, those were standard secure containers that are ubiquitous in tabulation in Georgia, aka nothing out of the ordinary. Additionally, the votes inside those containers weren't some stash of fake Biden ballots being used to steal the election, they were literally just normal votes which had been processed earlier in the day. The video which Giuliani and his team showed the Senate hearing conveniently omitted the footage from an hour earlier, when election workers could be seen on camera placing ballots which needed to be scanned into the containers, sealing them, and sliding them under the table. This was also done in the full view of the press and election monitors, so if they were trying to be sneaky about it, they weren't doing a very good job. Now, that brings us to the second part of the video. At 10:30 PM, you can see that everyone is packing up the station and grabbing their coats because they think that counting is done for the night. However, as everyone is doing this, the election director at this station, Ralph Jones, receives a phone call from his supervisor who informs him that they're not done and they have to keep counting. Jones then has the unfortunate task of telling all the election workers who are ready to go home that they have to stay and keep counting ballots, which is why they pull those 4 suitcases back out from under the table. Now, this sudden change in plan did lead to a brief mix-up. Because the workers had started to pack everything up, the press and election observers took this as their cue to leave the polling station. You know, they thought things were done for the night, and, to be fair, so did the election workers at that point. Anyway, they subsequently exited the building, and this meant that they were already gone by the time that Jones got the phone call and had to tell everyone that they were going to keep counting, and oh my god, did this become a hotbed for even more conspiracy theories. As we saw in that hearing, Giuliani tried to frame this as though the observers were told to leave so that the election workers could start rigging the election without there being any witnesses. Additionally, there were people like Eric Trump who claimed on Facebook that Republican observers were intentionally cleared out due to a water main burst so the fraud could commence, but this simply wasn't true. The chief investigator of this case, Francis Watson, reviewed all the footage, interviewed the workers who were present, and swore in an affidavit that no observer or member of the press had been asked to leave. Again, they simply left of their own volition when everybody started packing up. Also, that water main burst never actually occurred. There was a pipe leak in the morning at 6 AM, which did delay ballot counting by 2 hours, but this didn't affect the situation more than 15 hours later. But hold on, even if there was no plot to intentionally remove the observers, they still weren't present in the room as votes were being counted, which is kind of problematic, right? Well, from a strictly legal sense, no, actually. As Gabriel Sterling told reporters, who was a key election official in Georgia, state law permits observers to watch the vote counting process, but it wasn't a legal requirement for them to be there. That means the workers in that polling station were well within their right to tabulate votes, even though there were no independent witnesses present. Also, if it makes you feel better, one election observer would return to this polling station to watch the process at about 11:52 PM, so there was one person there for at least part of it. To really put the nail in the coffin here, Georgia was subject to 2 statewide recounts of the vote, which confirmed Biden's victory, and you also had investigators from the FBI analyze all 14 hours of surveillance footage. To quote them directly, nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false. So, now that everybody knew for certain that this entire story was bullshit, how do you think the Trump team would respond? Well, if you guessed that they'd continue to peddle this fake story because it benefited the narrative they were trying to fabricate, you'd be absolutely correct. In fact, 4 weeks later, Trump would directly reference this case as evidence of fraud during his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th.
In Fulton County, Republican poll watchers were ejected, in some cases physically, from the room under the false pretense of a pipe burst, water main burst. Everybody leave, which we now know was a total lie. Then election officials pulled boxes, Democrats, and suitcases of ballots out from under a table. You all saw it on television, totally fraudulent, and illegally scanned them for nearly 2 hours, totally unsupervised. Tens of thousands of votes. This act coincided with a mysterious vote dump of up to 100,000 votes for Joe Biden, almost none for Trump. Oh, that sounds fair.
Literally everything he said there had already been disproven at that point, but he simply did not care. If a fake story could help him in the slightest to overturn the election, then he would amplify it without a second thought. Also, going back to December, it turns out that Giuliani was actually doubling down on this footage as evidence of fraud, despite the fact it wasn't, and he was getting seriously unhinged. Just listen to what he had to say on December 10th about 2 black election workers who appeared in the footage.
Earlier in the day, of Ruby Freeman and Shay Freeman Morris and one other gentleman, quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine. I mean, it's obvious to anyone who's a criminal investigator or prosecutor, they are engaged in surreptitious illegal activity again that day. And after a week ago, and they're still walking around Georgia lying. They should have been questioned already. Their places of work, their homes should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud, because they obviously were engaged in it, and it's available to 300 million Americans to watch.
Wow, we'll ignore the racist undertones to that accusation for a moment, because it turns out there was an even bigger problem with Giuliani's allegation there. You see, these workers weren't passing around a USB port in the polling station, which is meant to, I don't know, hack into the voting machines. No, it was a fucking ginger mint. Yeah, that is perhaps the single most innocuous thing you can be caught passing around. And look, whilst the absurdity of that accusation is funny in a vacuum, the real-world consequences were a lot more serious. Both of the women which Giuliani just mentioned there would be endlessly harassed by Trump supporters, they'd receive countless death threats, and the FBI would even instruct them to leave their homes for their own safety in the week leading up to January 6th. On top of that, the FBI would discover that one of the Capitol rioters were in possession of an execution list which had both of the women's names on the document. This is what happens when you lie to your fanatical supporters for months on end and try to convince them of conspiracy theories which are just outright bullshit. The only silver lining to this whole situation is that Giuliani was forced to pay $148 million in damages for the outrageous claims he made against these women during this time. And look, those are just 3 of the main areas which conspiracy theorists were obsessed with after the election. I could go on and on with other theories like Sharpiegate, in which Trump supporters were intentionally given the wrong pens to invalidate their ballots, and there were even Chinese thermostats hacking voting machines. Yeah, that was one too. I hope it goes without saying, but these claims were entirely baseless, as was literally every conspiracy theory about the 2020 election. But look, to wrap up on all these conspiracy theories, I want to highlight something important, which we alluded to a little earlier. Trump knew this was all bullshit. Bill Barr, who was the Attorney General at the time, would investigate all of the claims which Trump asked him to. He'd look into them and find out that they were completely bullshit. He would relay that back to Trump, but it wouldn't matter. As Barr later told the January 6th committee, the president never showed any indication of interest in what the actual facts were. This is a sentiment shared by Chris Christie, who told the media this year that the crap that Donald Trump put out there about the 2020 election is fiction. It's make-believe. And by the way, I was there in 2020. He doesn't even believe it. He didn't believe it. He thought he lost, and he was afraid he was going to lose all during that fall. But look, baseless conspiracy theories don't overturn an election on their own. I mean, sure, they make for a great justification, which all your supporters can rally behind, but if you actually want to nullify the democratic will of your country and illegally assert yourself as president, well, that means you gotta do some actually criminal shit. So, just before we can dive into how Donald Trump tried to overturn the election, we first need to understand how the Electoral College works, i.e., the system the United States uses to pick its president. Basically, when Americans go out and vote on election day, they're not actually selecting the president themselves. Instead, their vote is going towards a group of electors from whatever state they live in. Now, 2 important things to note here. Firstly, the amount of electors scales with the population of the state. For example, California is home to almost 40 million people, so they get a group of 55 electors, whereas Wyoming only gets a group of 3 electors because they are home to just 700,000 people. Now secondly, each political party on a state level is responsible for selecting their group or slate of electors. If we go back to our example in California, before the election, the Democrats will pick their slate of 55 Democratic electors, and the Republicans will pick their slate of 55 Republican electors. Then, whichever party in that state receives the most votes is the winner, and their slate of electors are the ones who get to go and vote for the president. In California in 2020, Biden received 11 million votes, which was a whole lot more than Trump's 6 million votes, so it's his 55 Democratic electors who participate in the Electoral College and vote for him as president. Now, you may be wondering, what happens to the Republican slate of electors in California? Well, because they received less votes and therefore lost the election, nothing. They have literally no purpose to serve, and please keep this in mind for later. Now, before those 55 Democratic electors can go out and vote for Biden, the state first needs to certify its election results. In California, this occurred on December 4th when Alex Padilla, the Secretary of State, officially signed the certification. Once that's been sorted, it's then the governor of the state who has to prepare a document known as the Certificate of Ascertainment, which contains the names of all the electors from each political party and how many votes they received. On December 5th, Gavin Newsom would do this for California. Then, to finally wrap everything up, the slate of electors who are listed on that document meet in their state's capital sometime in the middle of December and formally cast their vote for president and vice president. Now, the reason all of this is important to us is because Donald Trump was about to target every single stage of the process I just outlined in an attempt to overturn the election. He was going to pressure state legislators to stop the vote from being certified, he was going to forge fake certificates of ascertainment and send them to Washington, D.C., and, perhaps most brazen of all, he was going to field a fake slate of Republican electors in several battleground states who tried to vote for him as president despite the fact they had zero legal authority to do so. Yeah, this is where we actually get to the crazy stuff. Now, just before we dive into things, I want to make something abundantly clear. This strategy was premeditated. Since at least September of 2020, Trump's plan to stop legislators from certifying the vote in battleground states was actively being reported on. To quote directly from an article published on September 23rd by Barton Gelman for The Atlantic, according to sources in the Republican Party at the state and national levels, the Trump campaign is discussing contingency plans to bypass election results and appoint loyal electors in battleground states where Republicans hold the legislative majority. With a justification based on claims of rampant fraud, Trump would ask state legislators to set aside the popular vote and exercise their power to choose a slate of electors directly. This reporting ultimately proved to be prophetic, as by mid-November, Trump and his allies were pursuing the exact avenues this article had outlined over a month and a half earlier. So, with all of that in mind, let's start with Trump's first strategy to overturn the election: pressure. As we just discussed, the first thing a state has to do before it can send out its electors is certify the vote. Obviously, if that doesn't occur, then nothing else can follow. This introduces a potential weak spot to the electoral process because, well, what if the most powerful man in the world was publicly demanding that you don't certify your state's vote because of all the rampant voter fraud, which didn't actually exist, but 30% of Americans thought it did? One of the clearest examples of this happening involved Doug Ducey, who was the governor of Arizona. As a Republican, he had been a close ally to the president throughout his entire 2020 campaign, but that began to change as more and more votes were counted in Arizona. Although it was a very slim margin, the result in Ducey's state was undeniable. Biden had won by over 10,000 votes. As you can probably imagine, Trump wasn't a fan of this reality, so he put Ducey in his crosshairs. To quote an article published by CNN, behind closed doors, Ducey said that the former president was pressuring him to find fraud in the presidential election in Arizona that would help him overturn his loss in the state. Trump would also deploy his vice president as a part of his strategy to crank up the pressure on Ducey, but it didn't work because Mike Pence actually had some principles and refused to strong-arm a governor into doing something illegal. Now, if this is where the story ended, it honestly wouldn't be that big of a deal. However, on the day that Arizona had to certify its vote, and as Ducey was literally in the process of signing the necessary documents, this happened. In case you missed it, somebody was calling Ducey, who had "Hail to the Chief" as their ringtone, aka the personal anthem of the President of the United States, and he immediately silenced it. As reports later confirmed, the person calling was in fact Trump, as he was desperately trying to get through in a last-ditch effort to stop the vote certification. That obviously failed though, and unfortunately for Ducey, there was no world in which the president was going to let him get away with that scot-free. So, later that night, Trump would issue this tweet. Why is he rushing to put a Democrat in office, especially when so many horrible things concerning voter fraud are being revealed at the hearing going on right now? What is going on with @DougDucey? Republicans will long remember. Then, a reporter from OAN, Christina Bobb, would tweet, "Gov Ducey has betrayed the people of Arizona," and Trump would amplify this sentiment, responding "true" in all caps. Then, to top it all off, the President of the United States would retweet a post written by a literal conspiracy theorist. Brian Kemp, Georgia's governor, who was also under intense public scrutiny from the president, "My state ran the most corrupt election in American history. Doug Ducey, hold my beer." Wow, that's a pretty epic tweet. And look, this right here was a crucial part of Trump's strategy. I know it may seem trivial because it's on Twitter, and Twitter is Twitter, but its effect was anything but. By making tweets like the ones we just looked at, the president was mobilizing his online swarm of MAGA minions to torment and harass public servants for simply doing their job and not breaking the law. For example, you know that Brian Kemp guy we just mentioned? Well, have a listen to this. Even without his many retweets, President Trump posted an average of about 1 tweet per day in December 2020, either criticizing Governor Kemp or pressuring him explicitly or implicitly to take actions to help overturn the election. 1 tweet every day. In particular, the president wanted Governor Kemp to call a special session in the Georgia state legislature so they could vote to overturn Biden's victory, but this was just blatantly illegal. But because Kemp refused to do something he literally couldn't, he had to suffer the wrath of MAGA zealots. He and his family were sent countless death threats, as apparently they'd taken bribes from China, and his children were also targeted on social media too. There was one particularly gross conspiracy theory surrounding his daughter's boyfriend, who tragically died in a car accident because he worked as a campaign staffer for a Republican senator. The harassment would get so bad that Kemp was forced to front the media in mid-December to put an end to all the baseless speculation. In total, the January 6th committee found that the Trump campaign contacted, or attempted to contact, nearly 200 state legislators from battleground states between November 30th and December 3rd to solicit backing for possible state house resolutions to overturn the election. And again, just to be clear, it is definitely not legal for a state legislature to vote to overturn the result of a presidential election. Now look, all of that is obviously terrible, but we need to discuss the most blatant example of Trump's pressure, the Raffensperger call. Barring the events of January 6th itself, this is perhaps the single most infamous moment from Trump's endeavor to overturn the 2020 election. For a little bit of context here, Brad Raffensperger was the Secretary of State in Georgia and a Republican who ardently supported the president. As you'll recall, the Secretary of State is the one that's ultimately in charge of certifying the vote, and this meant Raffensperger was in Trump's crosshairs by default. Now, when it actually came to the election in Georgia, the result was undeniable. There would be 2 statewide recounts which both confirmed that Biden was the winner, defeating Trump by 11,779 votes, which was an incredibly slim margin of just 0.23%. Of course, Trump would claim that there was widespread fraud and that the recount was a scam, but that didn't change the reality of the situation. So, on November 20th, Raffensperger would fulfill his duty and certify Biden as the winner, telling the media this.
"Working as an engineer throughout my life, I live by the motto that numbers don't lie. As Secretary of State, I believe that the numbers that we have presented today are correct. The numbers reflect the verdict of the people, not a decision by the Secretary of State's office or of courts or of either campaigns." As you can imagine, this is not a statement which the president appreciated. 6 days later, during a press conference at the White House, just listen to what Trump would say about Raffensperger.
Now that's called harvesting. You're not allowed to harvest, but I understand the Secretary of State, who is really, he's an enemy of the people. The Secretary of State, and whether he's Republican or not.
Yeah, an enemy of the people. A great language for a guy who actively supports you. These attacks would continue throughout December, but things really reached their apex on January 2nd. That morning, Raffensperger would appear on Fox News for an interview where he said this.
And people can't handle the truth sometimes because they're very disappointed in the results. And I get that. I voted for President Trump also, but at the end of the day, we did everything that we could. We did an audit of the race. President Trump still lost. Then we did a full recount. President Trump still lost. And so we have a safe, secure process, and people have to realize that you need to get out and vote, and that's how you win elections.
Once again, this was all very reasonable for Georgia's Secretary of State to be saying, but it wasn't an acceptable reality for the president. Just minutes after the segment concluded, Trump would reach out to Raffensperger, and a phone call to discuss the election was, quote, hastily arranged. Now, before we can dive into the extremely juicy content of this phone call, there's something important to address. Why do we know about this? Seriously, wouldn't a phone call between the president and a Secretary of State be an extremely exclusive affair? Well, unfortunately for Trump, the reason we know about this is because he made a very public blunder. On January 3rd, the day after the call took place, he tweeted this. I spoke to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. Just over an hour and a half later, Raffensperger would directly respond to this tweet, saying, "Respectfully, President Trump, what you're saying is not true. The truth will come out." And boy, he was not kidding. At 6 p.m. that night, the Washington Post would publish a bombshell article which revealed that the full 1-hour phone call had been recorded and leaked to the media. Raffensperger would later tell reporters that he initially had no intention of leaking the call, but because Trump had so blatantly misrepresented him on Twitter, he felt compelled to respond. And look, in this 1 hour of leaked audio, Donald Trump goes completely mask off about overturning the election.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
5 minutes later, Trump would reiterate this same demand, growing increasingly impatient as he did so.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
This was a stunning admission which was plastered on every headline the following morning. I just want to find 11,780 votes. I mean, come on. This single quote confirmed what everyone had been thinking. The president was working backwards. Like God. To translate what he just told Raffensperger there, I want to win Georgia. This is how many votes I need to win Georgia. Find me those votes so I can win Georgia. This is the definition of putting the cart before the horse. And look, this was all obvious to anyone who'd been keeping up with the election and its fallout, but hearing the words come directly out of the president's mouth, well, that was revealing, to say the least. As I mentioned, this is the line which all of the media fixated on because it's a good little soundbite, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. From basically the moment this call began, Trump was spewing the familiar conspiracy theories he'd been platforming to his supporters for months on end in hopes that it would somehow convince Raffensperger. You know, dead voters, out-of-state voters, underage voters, and all the other claims which had been debunked hundreds of times at this point. Most interestingly though, Trump seemed especially fixated on Ruby Freeman and the State Farm Arena video we discussed earlier, as he would go on to mention her by name 18 times throughout the phone call.
We're so far ahead of these numbers. Even the phony ballots of Ruby Freeman, known scammer. You know the internet? You know what was trending on the internet? Where's Ruby? Because they thought she'd be in jail. Where's Ruby? It's crazy. It's crazy. That was the minimum number is 18,000 for Ruby, but they think it's probably about 56,000. But the minimum number is 18,000 on the Ruby Freeman night, where she ran back in there when everybody was gone and stuffed. She stuffed the ballot boxes. Let's face it, Brad. I mean, they did it in slow motion replay, magnified, right? She stuffed the ballot boxes. They were stuffed like nobody's ever seen them stuffed before. So there's a term for it when it's a machine instead of a ballot box. But she stuffed the machine. She stuffed the ballot. Each ballot went 3 times. They were showing, here's ballot number 1. Here it is a second time, third time, next ballot.
What Trump was describing here was pure delusion. And this is something that Ryan Germany, Raffensperger's general counsel, who was also present on the call, would outline to the president.
This is Ryan Germany. We had our law enforcement officers talk to everyone who was there after that event came to light. The GBI was with them as well as FBI agents.
Well, there's no way they could. Then they're incompetent. They're either dishonest or incompetent. Okay, there's only 2 answers: dishonesty or incompetence. There's just no way. Look, there's no way.
Wow, what a mature response for a head of state to say about their own federal and state investigators. Also, just as a reference point, because I decided to do the maths, 77% of this 1-hour call was Trump rambling about his baseless conspiracies, 13% of it was his attorneys and advisors speaking on his behalf, and this left the remaining 10% of the call to Raffensperger and his general counsel. Just a heads up, if you have a discussion where your side speaks for 9/10 of the allotted time, you never had any intention of being persuaded. Anyway, there are 2 more key moments I want to highlight from this call.
The ballots are corrupt, and you're going to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense, and you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk.
Wow, that was a straight up threat from the president. He was suggesting that Raffensperger was committing a quote criminal offense by not overturning the election, which is a clear form of intimidation. Then, in a final attempt to pressure Raffensperger, Trump would utilize a different kind of leverage.
This is a faulty election result. And honestly, this should go very fast. You should meet tomorrow because you have a big election coming up. And because of what you've done to the president, you know, the people of Georgia know that this was a scam. And because of what you've done to the president, a lot of people aren't going out to vote. And a lot of Republicans are going to vote negative because they hate what you did to the president. Okay? They hate it. And they're going to vote. And if you would be respected, really respected, if this thing could be straightened out before the election. You have a big election coming up on Tuesday. And therefore, I think that it really is important that you meet tomorrow and work out on these numbers.
For context, Georgia had a crucial runoff election coming up on January 5th for its 2 federal Senate seats. They were currently held by 2 Republicans, but if they both lost, the Senate would go from 48-52 in the GOP's favor to a 50-50 split, which would give the Democrats an effective majority with Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote as vice president. The stakes were massive for this election in Georgia, and that's why Trump was trying to leverage it against Raffensperger. This was also an especially insane thing to do because Trump had spent the past 2 months trying to overturn the election instead of cutting his losses and campaigning in Georgia to help the Republicans maintain their Senate majority. Ultimately, this call was a terrible look for Trump. It gave the American people a clear insight into his frame of mind throughout this period and showed how utterly desperate he was to overturn the election. Also, as many legal experts would go on to argue, this phone call was potentially criminal. It is a violation of federal election law when a person, quote, knowingly and willfully deprives, defrauds, or attempts to deprive or defraud the residents of a state of a fair and impartially conducted election process. In fact, this phone call would be used as a key piece of evidence when Trump was indicted for election interference in 2023, but we'll talk more about that at the very end of the video. Ultimately, when it comes to the way in which Trump was pressuring officials to overturn the 2020 election, I think it's Mitt Romney who put it best. Having failed to make even a plausible case of widespread fraud or conspiracy before a court of law, the president has now resorted to overt pressure on state and local officials to subvert the will of the people and overturn the election. It is difficult to imagine a worse, more undemocratic action by a sitting American president. I can't believe he's going to make me say this, but Mitt Romney was right on the money here. In fact, throughout all of this post-election dismay, he was one of the only Republicans who didn't kowtow to the president whatsoever. But okay, that finally brings us to the main course. As we just saw, Trump wasn't able to stop any government officials from carrying out their election obligations, aka the pressure didn't work. Obviously though, that wasn't going to stop Trump from trying to overturn the 2020 election, so he was going to need a new strategy. Now, fortunately for the president, there was a wave of fanatics all across the country who wanted to help him with this endeavor, including one volunteer legal advisor named Kenneth Chesbrough. He had worked as an attorney, attended Harvard Law School, ran his own legal firm, and, as recently as 2016, he had actually been a registered Democrat. However, after making, quote, sizable returns on his investments in cryptocurrency, his politics began to shift to the right, and he even began to represent Republican lawmakers like Ted Cruz and Mike Lee in court. Now, he would really start to make a name for himself on December 6th when he sent a 6-page memo to James Trupus, an attorney for Trump's campaign team. In it, he outlined how Trump could stay in power, and I do apologize because we're about to go into more of the boring mechanics of how US elections work, but I promise it'll be worth it as they're about to do some comically illegal shit. Okay, as far as the electoral process was concerned, the next important date was December 14th. This is when the slate of electors that won in each state would meet in their capital and formally cast their vote for president and vice president. As a quick example, if we take a look at Georgia's official certificate of ascertainment, we can see that the Democratic electors received the most votes, which means it's this group of 16 people who meet in the Georgia state capitol and cast their votes. This is exactly what would go on to happen, as you can tell from the live stream footage of it happening. So far, so good. Then, once this has been completed, another document is produced called the Certificate of Vote. As the name suggests, this is basically just a record that keeps track of who the electors actually voted for. As you can see here with Georgia's Certificate of Vote, all 16 electors voted for Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president, with each of their signatures on the following page. Now, once this document has been prepared, every state is then required to send their Certificate of Vote to the United States Capitol for the second last part of the electoral process. This is where, during a joint session of Congress, every certificate is opened one by one, they're read aloud by the vice president, and is formally counted. Whichever candidate receives a majority of the vote is then declared the winner of the election, and to tie a nice little bow on everything, the elected president and vice president are inaugurated on January 20th, and they get their 4 years in office. Now, for the 2020 election, the date of the joint session of Congress to count all the electoral votes was set for, January 6th. That's a pretty interesting date, but okay. This is where Cheesebro's strategy comes into play. If we go back to Georgia's certificate of ascertainment, do you see these 16 Republican electors? Well, because they received 11,000 less votes than the Democratic electors, that means they lost the election. And if you lose the election, you don't get to vote for the president or vice president. This should be a fairly intuitive concept to grasp, but it wasn't for Kenneth Cheesebro. The strategy he devised basically said, okay, but what if our electors go and vote for Trump anyway? What if they still go and meet on December 14th, they cast their votes for Trump, and send their own competing certificate of vote to the United States Capitol? Then, on January 6th, during the joint session of Congress, this would create a situation where Mike Pence had 2 certificates from a handful of the states. From that point, he could simply just open the ones which voted for Trump, and not the ones which voted for Biden, and just like that, Donald has 4 more years. Now, I know this all sounds very exciting, but there was one small issue with this strategy. It was completely nonsensical. By Cheesebro's own admission, he thought that the Supreme Court would shoot this down if Pence tried to pick the fake certificates over the real ones because it was so comically unconstitutional. Put simply, the Republican electors in battleground states held 0 voting power because they didn't win their elections. If they tried to submit fake certificates to Congress, they would hold as much legal power as this certificate I just forged, where I, Max Morrow, get to be all 55 voters for the state of California. Also, as I hope you can tell, this ploy was extremely undemocratic. It would require Pence to reject some of the legitimate certificates, therein nullifying the will of the people in those states. I mean, look, this plan was just utterly ridiculous, and that's probably why the political genius that is Donald J. Trump was completely sold on the idea just days after Cheesebro published his memorandum. Remember, if something had a chance of overturning the election, then he was always going to be on board with it. So, I guess that brings us to step 1 of the plot: getting the electors. In theory, this shouldn't have been particularly challenging, as all of their names were listed on the official documents. Therefore, all you had to do was contact them one by one and ask them to show up at their state's capital on December 14th so they could vote for Trump, and maybe also forge a fake certificate too. Simple enough, right? Well, unfortunately, it turns out that a sizable portion of the electors had something called a conscience and could detect that there was something a little bit fishy about what they were being asked to do. Just have a look at what Josh Isaacson, a Republican elector from Georgia, told the Washington Post. It seemed like political gamesmanship, and that's not something I would have participated in. We have a process for certifying the election, we have a process for challenging the election. The challenges failed, so I wouldn't have participated in something that was going against all of that. Additionally, when Andrew Hitt, the Wisconsin Republican Party chairman, who was also an elector for the state, was contacted by Giuliani for a phone call about the plot, he texted one of his colleagues, "These guys are up to no good, and it's gonna fail miserably." I will note that Andrew would still participate in the plot despite making these comments, because he's clearly a very principled individual. Ultimately, 14 out of the 84 original Republican electors would bow out and refuse to participate in this plot. Now, you probably have some pointed questions for the remaining 70 Republican electors who still wanted to go through with this plan, but it actually isn't that simple. To see what I mean, just have a look at this excerpt from Special Counsel Jack Smith's 2025 report. On December 6th, for instance, Mr. Trump and John Eastman, more on that guy soon, called the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee and told her that it was important for the RNC to help organize Mr. Trump's elected nominees in the targeted states. During the call, John Eastman told a lie that the co-conspirators would use to induce the cooperation of many of the fraudulent electors, that Mr. Trump's electors' votes would only be used if ongoing litigation in their state proved successful for Mr. Trump. That's right, the Trump team framed this plot as a contingency plan to many of the electors. That means a good chunk of the electors only agreed to participate because they were under the impression that their votes and fake certificate would only be used if Trump won his ongoing court battles and was actually able to prove that there was widespread fraud in the election. To quote from that report again, this deception was crucial to the conspiracy, as many who participated as fraudulent electors would not have done so had they known the true extent of the co-conspirators' plans. So yeah, for some of these electors, they were outright deceived by the Trump team to participate in this plot. But anyway, that actually brings us to December 14th. As the legitimate slate of electors gathered in their respective capitals and began casting votes, so too did an entirely fraudulent slate of electors, or at least they tried to. At the Michigan State Capitol, a small group of fake Republican electors tried to enter the building, but they were immediately refused access by law enforcement. They tried to argue that they were the official GOP electors listed on the certificate of ascertainment, but the officer politely informed them that the legitimate slate of 16 electors had already arrived and were checked in. There was initially this insane plan for the fake electors to hide and sleep overnight in the state capitol so law enforcement couldn't turn them away in the morning, but that clearly didn't come to fruition. In other states, though, there was a little more success. In Arizona, for example, all 11 of the fake electors met, they cast their meaningless votes for Trump, they signed their fraudulent certificates, and they were so happy with themselves that they posted all about it on Twitter. We'll ignore the fact they willingly published evidence of themselves committing fraud for one moment, because it turns out there was a slight issue with the documents they produced. As you can see here, the official certificate of vote for Arizona is on some nice paper, the typography is beautiful, you've got the emblem at the top, and the official state seal at the bottom. As I'm sure you'd agree, this is all very professional looking. Now, compare that to the fake certificate that these numbskulls produced. I mean, sure, it has the correct text on it, but come on. This is some lazy ass forgery that was clearly put together by an unpaid intern on Microsoft Word in like 10 minutes. Now, putting the aesthetics to one side, the more pressing issue when it comes to this document is the fact that it's missing a signature from the governor and it doesn't have an official state seal, which means, well, nothing. The document means nothing. To quote directly from the January 6th report, the US Senate parliamentarian noted in correspondence by January 3rd that materials from the Trump team's supposed electors in Arizona had, quote, no seal of the state and no evidence that votes were delivered by the executive of the state for signature by electors, and, as a result, these materials failed to meet requirements of federal law. Yeah, unsurprisingly, documents of this nature have to meet very strict requirements, and this bullshit Microsoft Word certificate clearly did not. This is the same problem that the fake certificates from Georgia, Nevada, New Mexico, and Pennsylvania would also run into. Ultimately, when December 14th came to an end, there would officially be 306 votes cast for Joseph R. Biden, there'd be 232 for Donald J. Trump, and an additional 84 extra votes submitted by fake electors that were just completely fraudulent. They carried absolutely zero electoral significance, but that was of no concern to Trump. Now, if we go back to the initial plan for a moment, you'll notice that there's one guy who has an extremely important role to play for any of this to work. This guy, Mike Pence, aka the Vice President. During that joint session of Congress on January 6th, he's the one who actually presides over the opening and counting of votes, which means basically everything hinges on him. So, if there was one person who Trump needed to win over with this plan, it was Mike Pence, but that would be no easy task. For one, Pence wasn't seeing any real evidence that the election had been stolen from Trump, and that kinda makes it hard to go along with a plan of this nature. Although the president was doing a fantastic job of bombarding the public with his baseless conspiracies, we know that very few of his closest associates actually believed what he was saying, and Pence was no different. In fact, on January 2nd, the vice president and his staff would have a meeting with Matthew Morgan, the Trump campaign's top lawyer, and they all came to a pretty clear consensus. To quote Morgan himself, even if all the claims of fraud and irregularities were aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative. So, if Trump wanted to get Pence on board, this was the first roadblock he had to overcome. Now secondly, and this is the part we're really going to focus on, Trump also had to convince Pence that he actually had the constitutional authority to choose the certificates from the fake electors over the real ones, and spoiler alert, he absolutely did not, but that wouldn't stop Trump from trying. On January 4th, Trump would organize a meeting in the Oval Office with Pence, his advisors, and a guy called John Eastman. He was a law professor helping the Trump team, and at this point, he'd taken the reins from Kenneth Chesebro as the main architect behind this whole strategy. Anyway, Trump began rambling about all the usual stuff, telling Pence that he'd won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes, but then Eastman would take command. He told the vice president that there were basically two possible scenarios for January 6th. The first was the quote, more aggressive option, in which Pence could just outright reject the legitimate electoral votes submitted and pick the fake ones instead, which would hand Trump a very easy victory. Secondly, though, there was the quote, more politically palatable option, which would go something like this. Basically, on January 6th, Pence would begin opening and counting the votes from all of the states, starting with Alabama, and then proceeding alphabetically until he got all the way through to Wyoming. However, when he reached Arizona, well, there was a bit of a problem. Because he had one certificate from the real electors and one certificate from the fake electors, who literally published footage of themselves defrauding the government, well, what was he supposed to do? This was clearly an unsolvable dilemma, and he'd tell Congress that he was deferring his decision until he had counted and gone through all of the other states. He would then do the same thing for Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. After finishing the count, Pence would then be stuck with this group of 7 states who had disputed slates of electors. To resolve this, he would suspend the joint session of Congress and declare that he had to send these disputed slates of electors back to the states they came from, and the governments there would have to figure out which ones were legit. Now, because all of these states were Republican controlled, except for Nevada and New Mexico, Eastman hypothesized that their legislatures would determine that the fake electors were actually the legit ones. This would give Trump an additional 73 electoral votes, bringing his total up to 305, and would you look at that, our God Emperor is back for a second term. This option was just as destructive as the first one, but it didn't look as immediately dramatic. Unfortunately though, there was a slight issue. Every constitutional lawyer in the country thought that Eastman's plan was insane, including the ones giving legal advice to Mike Pence. All of it depended on a fringe reading of the Constitution and some bogus historical precedent which ascribed way more power to the vice president in the vote counting process than he actually had. In a 2-page memo which Eastman prepared for the Trump team on December 23rd, he wrote that the vice president was the quote, ultimate arbiter on January 6th and held the power to accept and reject certificates as he pleased. However, if you actually go and read Article 2 of the Constitution, it says the following. The President of the Senate, aka the Vice President, shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted. That's it. I'm not joking, that's literally it. He gets to open the certificates and then they get counted. What part of that even a little bit suggests that the Vice President has the supreme authority to reject certificates and send them back to the states of his own volition? Anyway, Mike Pence's legal counsel, Greg Jacob, had extensively researched this topic and came to a pretty clear verdict. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the vice president has that kind of authority to affect the outcome of the presidential election. Jacob stated that his review of text, history, and frankly just common sense all confirmed that the vice president had no such power. Additionally, a former federal judge by the name of J. Michael Luttig also gave some pretty clear advice. Luttig told Pence's staff on January 4th that the analysis Eastman offered in his first memo was incorrect. Luttig said subsequently that Eastman's advice was wrong at every turn, including his suggestion that the vice president could delay the electoral vote count. He would also tweet in the lead up to January 6th that the only responsibility and power of the vice president under the Constitution is to faithfully count the electoral college votes as they have been cast. I mean, hell, in late December, Pence had even organized a phone call with former Vice President Dan Quayle to ask him what to do, and his response was exactly what you'd expect. Mike, you have no flexibility on this. None. Zero. Forget it. Put it away. Pence would respond, you don't know the position I'm in, to which Quayle would respond, I do know the position you're in. I also know what the law is. You listen to the parliamentarian. That's all you do. You have no power, so just forget it. Look, all of that is to say that Eastman's deeply flawed constitutional arguments fell on deaf ears during this meeting. Now, to pressure Pence in private is one thing, but the public arena is where Trump would really leave his mark. Later that same day at a rally in Georgia, Trump would tell the crowd this.
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Boy, would that last part prove to be quite the understatement. Then, the following day on January 5th, Trump would only continue to ramp up the pressure on Pence, publishing this pretty controversial tweet. The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. Uh-oh, that's a pretty dangerous thing to be telling your fanatical supporters, especially when it's categorically not true. Later that same day, Trump would organize one final meeting with his vice president, this time one-on-one, with no legal counsel present. Remember, the joint session of Congress was going to happen tomorrow no matter what, so this was one of his last opportunities to change Pence's mind. And look, just so you can get a good idea of how this conversation went, I just have to directly quote a section from Bob Woodward's book, Peril. Although it's somewhat sensationalized, one of Pence's advisors would testify that it's, quote, generally consistent with his understanding of how the conversation went. If these people say you had the power, wouldn't you want to? Trump asked. I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority, Pence said. But wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power? Trump asked. No, Pence said. Look, I've read this and don't see a way to do it. We've exhausted every option. I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible. My interpretation is no. We've met with all these people. They're all on the same page. I personally believe these are the limits of what I can do. So, if you have a strategy for the 6th, it really shouldn't involve me because I'm just there to open the envelopes. You should be talking to the House and Senate. Your team should be talking to them about what kind of evidence they're going to present. No, 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 Trump shouted. You don't understand, Mike. You can do this. I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do this. That's right. The President of the United States was acting like an entitled toddler who didn't want to share any of their toys in the playground. I mean, look, it was just beyond apparent that Pence wasn't going to be convinced of this delusional plan, and this infuriated Trump. As the meeting concluded and Pence went to exit the Oval Office, the president would yell out at him, "You've betrayed us. I made you. You are nothing. Your career is over if you do this." Now, to be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. Pence was but a mere state governor back when Trump handpicked him to be his vice president in 2016, but it was completely uncalled for. Again though, Pence was unmoved, and later that night, his decision not to interfere with the vote certification was leaked to the media by someone in his inner circle. At 7:36 p.m., the New York Times would publish an article titled, "Pence said to have told Trump he lacks power to change election result." It detailed their meeting from earlier in the day, and it made something very clear to the American public. The vice president had no additional powers, and he was simply going to count the votes as per the Constitution. Now, here's a question for you. How do you think Trump would respond to this? Well, just over 2 hours later, he would publish a statement of his own, labeling that New York Times article as fake news. Additionally, Trump would also assert that he and the vice president were in, quote, total agreement that he has the power to act during the vote certification, which was just a bold-faced lie. After this statement went public, Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, was outraged and called Jason Miller, Trump's campaign advisor, but he refused to retract a single word from the president's statement. To cap off an utterly ridiculous 24 hours, Trump would publish one final tweet in the early hours of the morning. "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." For reference, Mike could not send it back, but you know that at this point. In fact, you know everything at this point because the stage has been set. Tomorrow was the day that the joint session of Congress would take place, and it's where Joseph R. Biden would be certified as the victor of the 2020 election. To be clear, that was the only legal outcome which could occur on January 6th, and anything else would cause a constitutional crisis. But remember, there was a large portion of Americans who seriously thought that Donald Trump was the true victor of the 2020 election. In their view, Biden and the Democrats were trying to rob them of a second term, so Mike Pence had an obligation to the American people to rectify that injustice. In fact, some of Trump's supporters felt so strongly in that conviction that they'd show up at the Capitol tomorrow, because as it turns out, the president had been organizing a little rally. Early in the morning on December 19th, Trump would publish this tweet. Peter Navarro releases 36-page report alleging election fraud more than sufficient to swing victory to Trump. A great report by Peter, statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Big protest in DC on January 6th. Be there, will be wild. I hope it goes without saying, but that report from Navarro, who himself was a Trump loyalist, was complete bullshit. It was filled with already debunked lies, and it cited almost exclusively pro-Trump media outlets as evidence. To quote one headline from the Washington Post, "This might be the most embarrassing document created by a White House staffer." Now, this wasn't particularly surprising for someone in the Trump administration, but it's that last part of the president's tweet which really raised some eyebrows. A big protest in Washington on the day that Congress would be certifying the vote? That's a pretty interesting decision. Then, 11 days later, whilst the president was on holiday at Mar-a-Lago, he would tweet again. January 6th, see you in DC. Damn, this is starting to get serious. In fact, just after he made that second announcement, a group called Women for America First filed an application to hold a rally at Freedom Plaza on January 6th, which was just a short walk from the White House. The cogs were starting to turn here, and it would be some of the president's most radical supporters that really heeded his call. Enter the Proud Boys. Founded by Gavin McInnes in 2016, they were ardent defenders of Trump and the MAGA movement and prided themselves on their opposition to essentially anything that was deemed woke or left-wing. This included feminism, immigration, LGBT people, Muslims, and anyone who didn't embrace the inherent superiority of America and the West more broadly. Although they were led by an Afro-Cuban man named Enrique Tarrio, more on him later, most critics saw this as a convenient cover for the group's deeply white supremacist beliefs. You know, they were doing the classic, I have a daughter, how could I possibly be sexist type of logic. Anyway, the Proud Boys exploded in popularity following the first presidential debate after Trump stumbled his way through this incredibly awkward sequence.
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name.
supremacists and
Who would
right
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what.
Stand back and stand by. What a fantastic choice of words to use about a group with militia-like elements. As you can imagine, members of the Proud Boys were absolutely ecstatic that the president had given them this bizarre quasi-endorsement in front of the entire country. To quote some Proud Boys directly, Trump basically said to go fuck them up. This makes me so happy. Standing down and standing by, sir. I was in awe. We reveled in it for a little bit, you know, like holy crap, the president just mentioned us. And then there were thousands and thousands of emails every day from people about wanting to join. According to one of their leaders, Jeremy Bertino, the Proud Boys would triple in membership after the presidential debate, which injected new life into their recruitment and activities. Anyway, when Trump announced that there was going to be a rally in the Capitol on January 6th, they were amongst the first groups to spring into gear. Actually, scratch that. Even before the rally was announced, they had been extremely active in their efforts to help Trump overturn the election. For example, on December 12th, there would be a group of about 200 Proud Boys who attended a Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C. Dressed in their patented black and yellow uniforms, they began violently clashing with counter-protesters late in the night, which resulted in 4 stabbings and 23 arrests. But anyway, once Trump formally announced the rally, the Proud Boys wouldn't waste any time. The next day, on December 20th, Tarrio would form a new chapter within the group known as the Ministry of Self-Defense, which only included hand-selected members. He'd also create a group chat for them, and this is where the bulk of the planning for January 6th would take place. 10 days later, on December 30th, things really started to escalate as a document titled 1776 Returns was circulated amongst Proud Boys leadership. It was only 9 pages long, but it provided a clear plan for the Proud Boys to breach and occupy key government buildings in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. They titled this portion of the plan Storm the Winter Palace, which was a reference to the Bolshevik Revolution that occurred in Russia more than a century prior. Ultimately, the plan hoped that occupying these key buildings would enable the Proud Boys to demand a new election in which there was no electronic voting, no mail-in ballots, and the whole process was to be monitored by the National Guard. Yeah, shit was getting serious. Then, most strikingly, Tarrio would send a rather conspicuous message to one of his private chats on January 3rd. What if we invaded? Later that day, another member in the group chat would write, what would they do if 1 million patriots stormed and took the Capitol building? Shoot into the crowd? I think not. According to testimony from another member of the group, Charles Donahoe, it was January 4th when Proud Boy leadership began seriously discussing the possibility of storming the Capitol, as they believed it would, quote, stop the government from carrying out the transfer of presidential power. Now, it's important to note that Tarrio himself wouldn't be present at the Capitol on January 6th because he was actually arrested 2 days before. At that December 12th rally we mentioned earlier, Tarrio was caught on film vandalizing a BLM banner outside of a black church, and this little incident caught up with him as he re-entered Washington, D.C. in preparation for January 6th. As he was arrested, officers found that he had 2 illegal, high-capacity magazines in his possession, which as we all know, is very normal for a rally-goer with peaceful intentions. A judge subsequently banned him from the Washington area for January 6th, but as we'll see shortly, he still played a crucial role in coordinating the events which unfolded. Now, along with the Proud Boys, there would be another important group which sprang into gear after Trump's rally announcement, the Oath Keepers. Founded by Elmer Stewart Rhodes in 2009, this was another far-right anti-government group whose members primarily came from military and law enforcement backgrounds. As you can probably tell by their name, the group were ardent defenders of the Constitution, particularly the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, and they also believed that the American government was becoming increasingly tyrannical. You know, Uncle Sam wants to impose martial law, take everybody's guns, and to quote directly from their doctrine, we will not obey any order to blockade American cities, thus turning them into giant concentration camps. Yeah, would you believe me if I said that they were a little conspiratorial? Anyway, just like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers were immediately active in efforts to overturn the election once it looked like Biden was going to win. In early November, their leader, Stewart Rhodes, would appear regularly on InfoWars with Alex Jones, to promote the Stop the Steal campaign and its rallies all across the country. As you'll see in this clip I'm about to show you, Rhodes was indulging in some pretty violent rhetoric from the onset.
It's either President Trump is encouraged and bolstered and strengthened to do what he must do, or we wind up in a bloody fight. We all know that. The fight's coming.
Then, at a Stop the Steal rally in Dallas on December 12th, Rhodes would continue to escalate his rhetoric.
He needs to know from you that you are with him, that if he does not do it now while he is commander-in-chief, we're going to have to do it ourselves later in a much more desperate, much more bloody war. Let's get it on now while he is still the commander-in-chief. Hooah!
What an incredibly awkward way to end a speech.
Hooah!
Anyway, these comments he'd been making thus far weren't out of the ordinary for an election-denying conspiracy theorist, but as January 6th got closer, things started to get a lot more serious. Following the president's rally announcement on December 19th, the Oath Keepers would begin amassing an arsenal of military-grade assault weapons and equipment in preparation for the vote certification. Rhodes himself spent over $17,000 in the weeks leading up to the rally, purchasing night vision goggles, weapon sights, and even an AR-15 with attachments. All of this military equipment was then stored in a hotel in Arlington, Virginia, which was just a 15-minute drive from the Capitol. This location was intended to be a quick reaction force, or QRF, which would be used on January 6th to support any Oath Keepers at the Capitol. To quote directly from a post which Rhodes made 2 days before the rally, "As we have done on all recent DC ops, we will also have well-armed and equipped QRF teams on standby outside DC in the event of a worst-case scenario where the president calls us up as a part of the militia to assist him inside DC." A group of these Oath Keepers would also attempt to organize firearm and combat training lessons from a company in Florida to prepare for January 6th, which, as we all know, is a very normal thing for peaceful rally goers to do. But look, the reason I highlight the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys in particular is to make one thing clear. There were a lot of people going to this rally who had really bad intentions. There's this common narrative that the events which transpired on January 6th were spontaneous, but this simply isn't true. There were people planning to cause trouble at the Capitol, and trouble they would cause. So, there we have it. I think I've finally told you everything there is to know in the lead up to January 6th. You know that Trump botched his re-election hopes for 2020, you know that he undermined mail-in ballots for months on end, you know how he falsely declared victory on election night when the result was still unknown, you know that he bombarded his supporters with baseless conspiracy theories, you know that all of his legal challenges in court amounted to nothing as he tried to overturn the election, you know how he pressured government officials, you know that he created a fake slate of electors, and you know that he was relying on a highly illegal plan involving Mike Pence to stop Biden's certification. January 6th was going to be Trump's last chance at overturning the 2020 election, and he needed to make it count. So, with all of that being said, it's finally time we talk about one of the most fateful days in modern American history. It was a fittingly bleak day on January 6th. Dark grey clouds stretched across the Washington skyline, and at no point would the sun be brave enough to peek through the covers. At around 6:30 a.m., as the nation was still struggling out of bed, a group of masked men approached Union Square with what appeared to be a collection of wooden pallets. Under the veil of darkness, they'd begin constructing a small staircase and platform with 2 large pillars. It wasn't initially clear what this structure was meant to be until the men returned several hours later to add one final touch: a crossbeam and bright orange noose. It would stand facing the Capitol building all day, sending one unmistakable message to the vice president. Just after 8 a.m., from the comfort of the White House, Trump would tweet this: "States want to correct their votes, which they know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage." 5 minutes later, he would issue another tweet: "The Republican Party and, more importantly, our country needs the presidency more than ever before. The power of the veto. Stay strong." Despite the fact Pence had made his intentions abundantly clear to the president, it did not matter. The public pressure would continue because Trump simply couldn't take no for an answer. Anyway, the plan for the day was pretty straightforward. Starting at 9 a.m., Trump supporters were set together at the Ellipse, the park that sits just south of the White House, for the Save America rally. It was going to feature guest speakers such as Donald Trump Jr., Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, and of course the president himself, who is set to deliver his speech at around midday. As thousands of Trump supporters began pouring through security, the National Park Service noted 2 interesting things. First, there was a quote significant number of attendees ditching their bags in trees so they couldn't be inspected, and 2, there were a lot of people who outright refused to walk through the magnetometers as they didn't want to be screened for weapons. In fact, when the president got down to the ellipse later in the day and saw that there were thousands of his supporters stuck outside of the rally itself, he was absolutely furious, probably because it made the crowd appear significantly smaller. According to Cassidy Hutchinson, a White House legislative aide, Trump would yell in response, "I don't fucking care that they have weapons, they're not here to hurt me, take the fucking mags away." At approximately 11 a.m., Rudy Giuliani would take center stage with the architect of the Mike Pence strategy, John Eastman, by his side. There were now tens of thousands of impassioned Trump supporters at the ellipse, and Giuliani would tell them exactly what they wanted to hear.
Who hides evidence? Criminals hide evidence, not honest people. So, over the next 10 days, we get to see the machines that are crooked, the ballots that are fraudulent, and if we're wrong, we will be made fools of. But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail. So, let's have trial by combat.
A trial by combat. Of course, this particular comment would age horrifically in the hours that followed. Back at the White House, Trump was working on his speech with Stephen Miller, but was desperate to organize a final meeting with Pence. The vice president hadn't picked up when Trump tried to call earlier in the day, but at 11:20 a.m., the two would have a brief but explosive conversation over the phone. Pence reiterated that he simply did not have the power to pick and choose electoral votes, which is what every constitutional scholar in the country was saying, because the vice president's role in the count was merely ceremonial. This upset the president, and to quote directly from Bob Woodward's book, Peril, "Mike, this is not right," Trump said. "Mike, you can do this. I'm counting on you to do it. If you don't do it, I picked the wrong man 4 years ago." As Trump kept pushing Pence, the president's body man, Nick Luna, entered and handed the president a note. They were ready for him at the rally outside. His people were waiting. "You're going to wimp out," Trump said. His anger was visible to others in the Oval Office, including his daughter Ivanka. According to Trump's own account of the conversation months later, he also told Pence, "You can either go down in history as a patriot, or you can go down in history as a pussy. You can be Thomas Jefferson, or you can be no Thomas Jefferson." Of course, Pence was unmoved by the president's insults, and the call would end without any new developments. Also, I think it's worth noting that this would actually be the last time Trump and Pence communicated with one another until 5 days later on January 11th. Following this call, Trump and his team would make their way down to the ellipse, and at 11:57 a.m., from behind a shield of bulletproof glass, the president would begin his speech. In front of him were 53,000 of his impassioned supporters, and for the next 70 minutes straight, he was going to regurgitate the same election lies that he'd been peddling for the past 2 months straight.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
He would go on to mention the dead voters in Georgia, the rigged Dominion machines, the fact there were more ballots than voters in Pennsylvania, there weren't, and he'd also make an especially big fuss about the State Farm Arena video. According to the January 6th report, there were more than 100 times during the speech where Trump either lied about a specific example of fraud or just outright claimed that the election had been stolen. Now, despite the clear decision which Pence had made over the phone less than an hour prior, Trump would begin to pressure his vice president just 5 minutes after his speech began.
And I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. He has the absolute right to do it. We're supposed to protect our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people.
Trump would make another 3 comments to this effect during his speech, falsely asserting that Pence had the power as vice president to change the outcome of the vote certification. But okay, that brings us to the most important moment in this speech. 15 minutes after getting on stage, and 274 days since he manufactured his very first lie about the integrity of the 2020 election, Trump would say this.
And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
Now, to be abundantly clear, the president would highlight that this march was going to be a peaceful one.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Today we will see whether Republicans stand strong for integrity of our elections, but whether or not they stand strong for our country.
However, you've got to consider this in the context of the rest of the speech. For example, just listen to the type of language he was using as he made some of his final remarks.
But I said, something's wrong here, something's really wrong, can't have happened, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Additionally, when we consider Trump's actions later in the day, or the lack thereof when violence began to erupt, it's hard to take this one comment about a peaceful march purely at face value. Anyway, just after 1 PM, as his speech came to a close, Trump would once again instruct his supporters to begin their march towards the Capitol building, YMCA would begin blaring over the speakers, the president would do his awkward little dance, and the masses would begin their 2-mile pilgrimage. However, these were by no means the first people to arrive at the Capitol. 2.5 hours earlier, at 10:30 AM, somewhere between 200 and 300 Proud Boys gathered at the Washington Monument to begin their own march towards the Capitol building. Usually, the Proud Boys wore yellow and black when they attended protests to make their presence known, but that wasn't the case today. 2 days earlier, Tario had posted to Parler announcing that anyone who planned to attend the Capitol had to be incognito, so they weren't as easy to identify. For the next couple of hours, the group wouldn't do much except march around the Capitol, chanting with their megaphone, but that would change at 12:49 PM. As Trump was still delivering his speech, a group of Proud Boys would arrive at the Peace Circle, a very ironic name in retrospect, which is located just a few hundred meters away from the Capitol building itself. Now, it's important to note that this location held a lot of strategic value because it was the exact spot where tens of thousands of rallygoers would end up after they finished marching down Pennsylvania Avenue like the president instructed. There were already a significant amount of protesters gathered at this spot, so the Proud Boy leaders began riling them up with chants like "Fuck Antifa" and "We Love Trump." Things would begin to escalate at 12:53 PM when this protester named Ryan Samsel, who had just spoken with Proud Boys leader Joe Biggs, began to approach the police barricade. Now, I will note that the details surrounding this short exchange between the two are highly contested. At one point, Samsel was claiming that Biggs flashed his gun in an effort to pressure him to approach the police, but this was later rescinded, and Biggs himself denies that it ever happened. Regardless though, it was this moment when Samsel advanced forward that the floodgates literally began to break, as a wave of protesters would soon join him. Within seconds, the crowd began violently shoving the barricades, which caused one female police officer, Caroline Edwards, to fall to the ground, knocking her unconscious. She's quickly helped up, but the officers are massively outnumbered by the protesters, they're officially rioters now, so they retreat towards the Capitol building when the barricades fall. Now, as all of this is happening, there's another small group of rioters just south of the Peace Monument who begin to remove the mesh fence blocking off the west front lawn. By destroying the barricades at these 2 points, the rioters have created a direct pathway to the Capitol building for all the rallygoers who will eventually come from Trump's speech. By 12:57 PM, the rioters coming from the Peace Monument begin to group around the west front of the Capitol behind this black fence, which does a very impressive job of holding them back for all of 90 seconds. As you can see, a small group of rioters breach the fence on the right side, and like helium filling a balloon, everybody begins flooding into this new restricted area. Fortunately, they are met by a wall of police officers, which stops them from advancing any further, but this is the last line of defense. Past this point, there's literally nothing to stop them from reaching the lawmakers inside the Capitol, who were about to start certifying the vote. And unfortunately, these rioters were about to get a whole lot angrier. At 1:02 PM, just a few minutes before the joint session of Congress was set to commence, Mike Pence would publish a letter to the American public via Twitter. He hadn't told Trump or his team that he was going to do this, but it made the vice president's intentions crystal clear. It is my considered judgment that my oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. 4 years ago, surrounded by my family, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, which ended with the words, "So help me God." Today, I want to assure the American people that I will keep the oath I made to them, and I will keep the oath I made to Almighty God. When the joint session of Congress convenes today, I will do my duty to see to it that we open the certificates of the electors of the several states, we hear objections raised by senators and representatives, and we count the votes of the Electoral College for President and Vice President in a manner consistent with our Constitution, laws, and history. So help me God. That was it. Mike Pence wasn't going to bend the knee. He would preside over the joint session of Congress, he would open and count the votes as the Constitution demanded, and he'd certify Biden as the winner. This was the final avenue for Trump to overturn the election, and it had failed. Shortly after the letter was published, Pence would enter the House chamber to thundering applause. He'd outline how the certification was going to proceed, and with that, the count would formally begin. As expected, Alabama and Alaska were certified without any objections, but when the vice president reached Arizona at 1:12 p.m., Representative Paul Gosar and Senator Ted Cruz would do this.
Are there any objections to counting the certificate of vote of the state of Arizona that the teller has verified appears to be regular in form and authentic?
Mr. Vice President, I, Paul Gosar from Arizona.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
I rise for myself and 60 of my colleagues to object to the counting of the electoral ballots from Arizona.
Is the objection in writing and signed by a senator?
Yes, it is.
It is.
Wow, some truly shameful stuff. Now, just to be clear, objections were a legal part of the certification process, and Pence had been anticipating this to happen, so he ordered the joint session to split into their separate chambers for debate. This also occurred at the same point that Trump's speech finished at the ellipse, which meant thousands of his fired-up supporters were now descending on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, as you may recall, Trump told the crowd that he'd be marching alongside them on the way to the Capitol, but once he departed from the ellipse in his motorcade, the Secret Service informed him that there was absolutely no chance he was going to do that. They were receiving preliminary reports of the situation on the ground, and they rightfully concluded that it was by no means safe for the president to be there. Unsurprisingly, this infuriated Trump, and according to Cassidy Hutchinson, he yelled, "I'm the fucking president, take me up to the Capitol now." After the Secret Service again denied him, he allegedly tried to grab the wheel and lunged at the driver's neck out of anger. It's important to note that this allegation was not corroborated by two other witnesses in the car, so it's unclear if this is what truly transpired. Anyway, Trump and his motorcade would arrive back at the White House at 1:21 p.m., and this is when he was first informed that the Capitol was under attack. Trump would then make his way to the presidential dining room, sit down at the table with a can of Diet Coke, and he would remain seated there watching television for the next 5 hours straight, barring one momentary interruption later in the afternoon. Although he wouldn't attempt to contact law enforcement or anybody at this time to deal with the ongoing situation at the Capitol, he would brag to his aides that he'd never spoken to a crowd that big before, estimating there were, quote, about 1 million people out there. Back at the Capitol, law enforcement had actually done a good job of reclaiming the restricted area which rioters had initially breached. Starting just after 1:11 p.m., a group of officers would descend down this staircase, and they'd begin slowly pushing rioters back to re-establish a buffer zone. Within half an hour, they would manage to reclaim a majority of the restricted area with an even stronger officer presence. Unfortunately though, a problem would soon arise elsewhere. Whilst law enforcement had done a good job of reinforcing the area immediately in front of the west side of the Capitol, there was a staircase slightly to the north surrounded by scaffolding, which was highly vulnerable. At 1:50 p.m, a rider at the front, who was later identified to be a Proud Boy, would begin shoving the officers back, causing the crowd around them to surge forward up the staircase. It's at this moment that the DC Metropolitan Police would officially declare the situation a riot, and literally as all of this is happening, the president is on his phone retweeting a recording of his speech from an hour earlier to his supporters on Twitter. Officers would temporarily stop the crowd from advancing any further up the northern staircase, and at 2:03 p.m, after a loudspeaker would announce that people had to leave the area, law enforcement would begin deploying tear gas and flashbangs to disperse the crowd. This would provide temporary relief, but at 2:09 p.m, rioters would overwhelm the officers holding the northern staircase, and they'd begin surging straight towards the Capitol building itself. There's a brief moment where a group of officers tried to stop the rioters from advancing past the upper terrace, but because they're so vastly outnumbered, it amounts to nothing. This group of rioters then advance towards the windows of the Capitol itself, they begin pounding on them with their fists, and one rioter begins using a piece of wood to partially smash the glass. Ultimately, at 2:12 p.m, it would be another Proud Boy by the name of Dominic Pizzola who officially breached the Capitol using a stolen riot shield to smash open this window. Within mere seconds, dozens of rioters begin flooding into the building. At this point, both chambers of Congress were still in session and actively debating the objection which had been raised to Arizona's vote. Now, you might think this is crazy because holy fuck, there are rioters actively flooding into the building, but to quote Shane Smith, who is one of Nancy Pelosi's assistants, you're inside the chamber, there are no TVs, there are no radios, I mean, you're not really supposed to be on your phone. We were kind of oblivious to it. That's right, whilst a lot of lawmakers knew that Trump supporters were gathering around the Capitol, they had no idea how quickly the situation had escalated. It was only once the Secret Service swooped into the Senate to evacuate Mike Pence, which occurred roughly at the same time that Dominic Pizzola smashed the window, that people realized just how serious the situation was. Pence was brought back to his office where his wife and daughter were located, and moments later, the Senate would be gavelled into recess, and you can just see the panic building as lawmakers are escorted out. Now, this brings us to a couple of crucial moments involving Officer Eugene Goodman. Although the response from law enforcement was woefully inadequate on January 6th and led to mass resignations in its aftermath, Officer Goodman was a shining outlier who displayed tremendous bravery as rioters began flooding the corridors. Firstly, as the Capitol itself was breached, he can be seen running down this hallway, directing Mitt Romney to turn around, as he doesn't realize that there's a wave of rioters quickly approaching. Thankfully, Romney heeds this warning and immediately turns around because who knows what would have happened to one of Trump's biggest critics if he came face to face with the violent mob. Now secondly, it's what he did next that would have him awarded both the Congressional Gold Medal and Presidential Citizens Medal. At 2:14 p.m., just after the Capitol was breached, he can be seen single-handedly holding off a swarm of rioters, yelling at them to stay back. Unfortunately, given it's a 1v20, this request is promptly ignored by the rioters, and they begin to surge forward, following Goodman up the staircase. Now, it's at this point where something crucial happens. As he's trailing backwards, Goodman looks over his left shoulder where the entrance to the Senate floor is located. For reference, lawmakers have only just begun to evacuate the chamber at this point, and the door is wide open, so he knows he can't let the rioters anywhere near that entrance. For a brief moment, you can see that he considers blocking the doorway himself, but then he quickly changes his strategy. Because he'd be overwhelmed by the rioters within seconds if he stood at the Senate entrance, he instead shoves the guy with the QAnon shirt to draw the mob's attention and starts walking in the complete opposite direction. Within one split second, Goodman decides that he's basically going to treat himself like human bait so that he can lure the rioters away from the Senate, and it actually works. They continue to follow him down the hallway until they reach another room filled with officers, leading to a stalemate in which the mob can no longer advance. To quote directly from an article in the Washington Post, had the rioters turned right, they would have been a few feet away from the main entrance into the chamber. On the other side of that door, had they made their way into the Senate, were at least half a dozen armed officers, including one with a semi-automatic weapon in the middle of the floor, scanning each entrance for intruders. Goodman's quick thinking bought the Capitol Police enough time to seal the Senate entrance, therefore avoiding a potentially horrible mass casualty incident. Unfortunately though, the situation was deteriorating elsewhere. So far, I've only focused on the west side of the building, as that's where the initial breach occurred, but there was also a wave of protesters advancing from the east side as well. At 2:06 p.m, this group managed to breach the police line, which was protecting the east staircase, and rioters were now attempting to force their way through the Columbus doors, which was the primary entrance to the Capitol on this side of the building. As hundreds of people begin to flood this area, you can see one guy get a little too excited. He jumps onto this ledge so he can start kicking down the windows, vive la révolution, and as soon as he does, well, law enforcement catches up with him pretty quickly. Capitol Police would successfully hold this side of the building for about 15 minutes, but that would change just after 2:20 p.m. This man, George Teeny, who had entered the Capitol from the west side, would come over to the Columbus door and partially open it from the inside. Capitol staff would rush over to stop him. There would be a struggle for a few minutes in which a riot officer is thrown to the ground, and a dozen or so people are able to slip inside. Law enforcement would briefly re-establish control and close the door, but then a fresh swarm of rioters would return, and the floodgates would be opened. Now, as you've probably been able to tell, this situation is quickly spiraling out of control, and we're yet to hear anything from the president himself, but that would change at 2:24 p.m. And look, at least in my view, what you're about to hear next is the single most outrageous thing Donald Trump does in this whole election fraud saga, and that should really tell you something given everything we've covered thus far. From the safety of the presidential dining room, watching Fox News with a Diet Coke in his hand, Trump would issue this tweet. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones that they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. It's really hard to articulate just how fucking insane that tweet is. As rioters were actively breaching the Capitol and lawmakers thought they were about to die, the President of the United States decided to escalate the situation. Remember, he knew there was an attack on the Capitol as early as 1:21 PM, and it had been declared a riot by DC police more than half an hour before he sent this tweet. Knowing this information, Trump didn't tell the rioters to get the fuck out of the Capitol, no. Instead, he decided to attack his vice president and put his life into jeopardy. To quote directly from the January 6th report, it was an unprecedented scene in American history. The President of the United States had riled up a mob that hunted his own vice president. 90 seconds after Trump issued that tweet, the Secret Service would escort Pence and his family out of the office and down this staircase to get them to a secure location in the basement. This was an extremely risky decision because there were already so many rioters actively roaming through the hallways, but the situation was only going to get worse and worse as time passed. So, with that in mind, the Secret Service ultimately made the decision to dash for the basement down through the staircase, and this brought Pence and his family within 40 feet of the rioters as they fled. Had they waited any longer to make that call, with rioters in the building beginning to chant "Hang Mike Pence" in response to the president's tweet, who knows what would have happened. And look, it was at this point that even Trump loyalists were starting to recognize how serious the situation was. Laura Ingraham from Fox News would try to convince the president to take action, messaging Mark Meadows, "The president needs to tell people in the Capitol to go home. This is hurting all of us. He is destroying his legacy and playing into every stereotype. We lose all credibility against the BLM Antifa crowd if things go south." Marjorie Taylor Greene, who at this point in time was one of the president's most loyal defenders in Congress, would also message Meadows saying, "Mark, I was just told there is an active shooter on the first floor of the Capitol. Please tell the president to calm people. This isn't the way to solve anything." Additionally, the closest aides surrounding Trump in the presidential dining room were also pressuring him to act. Dan Scavino, his deputy chief of staff, spent 20 minutes at one point trying to convince the president to release a statement, even printing out a series of potential messages that Trump could use to post on Twitter. Ultimately, at 2:38 PM, the president would finally act, tweeting out this: "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful." To be clear, this was a woefully inadequate response, which all but guaranteed further violence. He didn't tell rioters, who were trespassing on federal property by the way, to get the fuck out. He merely told them to support law enforcement, whatever that means. Also, there was no staying peaceful, because that would imply there was peace to begin with, and if that wasn't bad enough, just listen to the conversations which were going on at the White House during this time. To quote the January 6th report, Sarah Matthews, the White House Deputy Press Secretary, told the Select Committee that President Trump resisted using the word peaceful. The president added the words "stay peaceful" only after Ivanka Trump suggested the phrase. Yeah, if it weren't for his own fucking daughter being in the room with him, the word peaceful would have been omitted entirely. It's also around this point in the day that our good friend Enrico Tarrio would start getting very active on social media. At 2:36 PM, he posted, "I'm enjoying the show, do what must be done, #WeThePeople." 2 minutes later, at 2:38 PM, he posted, "Don't fucking leave." At 2:39 PM, he would message one of his private Proud Boy group chats saying, "Make no mistake, we did this," and at 2:41 PM, he would wrap up this posting spree with one final message: "Proud of my boys and my country." Wow, how patriotic. I sure hope none of these posts or messages become extremely incriminating during a trial down the road. Anyway, going back to that Trump tweet for a moment, it did literally nothing to calm rioters, as they would go on to breach the Senate chamber 4 minutes after it was published. This is where some of the most infamous images and videos would come from, as rioters had an absolute field day trespassing into one of the most sacred rooms in the entire country. They'd read through lawmakers' documents, Q Sharman would take his place at the vice president's chair, and there'd even be a group prayer. However, on the opposite side of the Capitol, things were a lot more serious. Unlike the Senate, which had been fully evacuated, there were still lawmakers trapped inside the House chamber, so Capitol Police had barricaded the doors to prevent rioters from getting in, but they were making a serious push to get through. At one point, through a partially smashed doorway, which Capitol Police had their handguns directly aimed at, Republican Congressman Troy Nehls had this heated exchange with rioters.
We're sick of it. Okay? 30 years. Would you? Huh? And I've never had people act this way. Say again? I've been in law enforcement in Texas for 30 years. Talk a little louder. That's because you've never seen corruption like we have seen this last month. I'm ashamed. And I'm ashamed of my Congress people. They don't even stand up for it.
This conversation would produce one of the most infamous images from January 6th, which would feature on the front page of newspapers all around the world. At this point, many of the lawmakers trapped inside would pray and make phone calls to their loved ones as they genuinely feared that they were about to be killed by rioters. There was even this one crazy story from Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego, a former Marine who served in Iraq, which I just got to quote directly. "I didn't find any weapons. The best thing I found was a pen, and that was gonna have to be it. It looked bad. I was teaching my colleagues how to stab the rioters in the neck and stab them in the eye. I don't give a fuck. Like, I would have killed all those motherfuckers to save this democracy. Fuck those guys." As you can tell, they were preparing for the worst possible scenario. Ultimately though, it would be just outside the Speaker's lobby, a hallway which sits behind the House chamber, that the day's most tragic events would occur. At 2:44 PM, a group of rioters were attempting to smash through this barricaded door, which would give them a direct pathway to the lawmakers hiding inside, but it was being guarded by Officer Michael Byrd. He tries to give the rioters several warnings. One of them understands the situation and tells the others to stop smashing the window. Another notes that the officer is literally pointing his gun at the door. But a woman named Ashley Babbitt tries to climb through anyway, and is immediately shot in her left shoulder. A response team would administer aid and transport her to Washington Hospital Center, but she would succumb to her injuries shortly thereafter. Following a later investigation, the Justice Department wouldn't bring any charges against the officer, as it was deemed a lawful use of force to protect the members of Congress who were trying to evacuate the House chamber. To be clear, Officer Byrd was the last person standing between this violent mob and lawmakers in the chamber, and if rioters began pouring through that window after they saw Ashley Babbitt go through, there's no doubt in my mind that that would have become a mass casualty incident. Although it was certainly a justified use of force, it was still an unmistakable tragedy, and the only reason it occurred was because of lies planted by the President of the United States 9 months earlier, which subsequently snowballed out of control. Anyway, shortly after this occurred, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy would call the White House, he'd be connected directly to Trump, and they'd have an urgent conversation over the phone. "You've got to get out and tell these people to stop. I'm out of the Capitol. We've been run over," McCarthy said. He was intense. "Someone just got shot. I'll put a tweet out," Trump said. "I've never seen anything like this," McCarthy said. "You've got to tell them to stop. You've got to get them out of here. Get them out of here now." Trump did not seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. He never asked about McCarthy's safety, and one remark stood out. "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are." This was his response when he found out that someone had been shot, and it's almost beyond parody. McCarthy was one of the highest ranking Republicans in Congress, yet Trump had next to zero regard for his safety. But hey, at least he'd follow through on that tweet he promised, publishing this at 3:13 PM. "I am asking for everyone at the US Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. Thank you." You hear what he said there? Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. Well, do you want to know what that respect actually looked like on the ground? At the west side of the building, rioters had once again breached the police line and were trying to force their way into the Capitol tunnel. Fortunately, officers were holding this position extremely well, and at one point, about 4 minutes after Trump issued that previous tweet, they actually managed to push the rioters all the way out of the tunnel. However, in doing so, an officer named Michael Fanone was caught out by a member of the mob and dragged into the ocean of rioters. He was beaten from all sides, and as he was pinned down, a man named Daniel Rodriguez would tase Officer Fanone at the base of his skull 2 times, and the blood-curdling screams of pain he lets out are genuinely horrifying. As this was all happening, members from the crowd would yell, "Get his gun, kill him with his own gun." It wasn't until Fanone yelled out, "I've got kids," that a couple of the rioters would step in and push him back up towards the tunnel. His fellow officers would then grab him, and as soon as he was safe, he collapsed to the ground unconscious, suffering a mild heart attack. This is what the party of law and order were doing to their men in blue, and scenes like this are why it was so outrageous that the president hadn't told his supporters to leave the Capitol. That was the most crucial thing needed in this moment, because he was the only one these people were going to listen to until more officers could provide backup and get the situation under control. Now, I'm not just saying this with the benefit of hindsight, because this is exactly what everyone around him was saying. At the same time he issued that previous tweet, one of the president's advisors, Alyssa Farah, would message Mark Meadows, "POTUS has to come out firmly and tell protesters to dissipate. Someone is going to get killed." 18 minutes after that, Sean Hannity from Fox News would also message Meadows, "Can he make a statement? I saw the tweet. Ask people to peacefully leave the Capitol." Half an hour after that, the president's own son would again message Meadows, "We need an Oval Address. He has to lead now. It's gone too far and gotten out of hand." I mean, for fuck's sake, Biden would address the country and demand the rioters to leave the Capitol before the president himself.
Therefore, I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege.
How do you let sleepy Joe Biden beat you to the punch? Ultimately, it wouldn't be until 4:17 p.m., almost 3 hours since he was first told that the Capitol was under attack, that he would finally address the nation, and Jesus Christ, I think I just have to play it in full.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
You have got to be fucking me. I mean, sure, he finally told rioters that they needed to leave the Capitol, and guess what? They would start to disperse as soon as the president posted this video, but everything else in that address was a complete embarrassment. To continue to perpetuate the narrative of a stolen election as the heart of American democracy was actively under siege borders on insanity, as does the decision to tell the rioters that you love them and that they're very special. To again quote from Betrayal, he was finally telling his supporters to go home, but he wasn't condemning their actions. In fact, as the message went on, it was clear that what he was really condemning, yet again, was the election. We love you. You are very special. That was Trump's message to the people who had just beaten police officers, broken into the Capitol, and screamed out for the execution of Vice President Pence. And look, this is something we'll touch on in the next section, but why wasn't this video published earlier? You know, instead of throwing Mike Pence under a bus at 2:24 p.m. with that genuinely disgusting tweet as rioters were actively breaching the Capitol, he could have simply recorded and posted this video. That's all he had to do to 1. Minimize his own level of accountability, and 2. Actually de-escalate the situation, yet he delayed and delayed for another 2 hours. Remember, he was watching Fox News and their coverage of the attack, Kevin McCarthy had told him that shots were fired, and around this same time, he was also directly informed of the shooting by his staff. To quote the January 6th report, a handwritten note, dashed off onto a White House pocket card and preserved by the National Archive, read, "One-time civilian gunshot wound to chest at door of House chamber." One White House employee saw the note on the dining table in front of President Trump. In what world do you discover that shots have been fired at the Capitol and don't immediately spring into action? But look, even though it was riddled with lies and it was 3 hours too late, this video was a massive turning point in the day as rioters began to disperse and law enforcement would re-establish control after it was published. To quote directly from Stefan Ayres, a rioter who was at the Capitol, "That's how I look at it. Like, hey, chill out," because he said, "Alright guys, let's cool it out." I wish he would have done it, 10 minutes after he had seen what started and what was going on. But kind of following that as like, let's get out of here, which I wish it would have been done a little earlier, honestly. For people that were like me, that were there, we weren't there to cause trouble, we were there to basically be a peaceful protester. I think that would have really swayed people like me. It would take about 2 hours for all of the rioters to be removed from the Capitol, and at 6:14 p.m, a security perimeter would be established around the building once again. At this point, with darkness beginning to sweep over Washington, photographers would again capture some of the day's most iconic images. Police munitions exploding, smoke billowing towards the sky, American flags waving everywhere, and a democracy left in tatters. Around this time in the evening, the president would issue one final tweet before his account was suspended by Twitter for 12 hours. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. There was no question that this day would be remembered forever, but perhaps not in the glowing way which Trump imagined here. Just after 8 p.m, once the building had been fully secured, lawmakers would return to the Capitol, and at 8:06 p.m. on the Senate floor, a defiant Mike Pence, who just hours earlier was hearing calls for his execution, would tell the nation this.
And as we reconvene in this chamber, the world will again witness the resilience and strength of our democracy. For even in the wake of unprecedented violence and vandalism at this Capitol, the elected representatives of the people of the United States have assembled again on the very same day to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So may God bless the lost, the injured, and the heroes forged on this day. May God bless all who serve here and those who protect this place. And may God bless the United States of America. Let's get back to work.
Look, as much as I detest this man and just about everything he did as vice president in the 4 years leading up to this moment, there's no denying the fact that he showed enormous courage in the face of such debilitating pressure inflicted by his own president. In fact, whilst he was hiding in the loading dock underneath the Capitol, the Secret Service insisted that they evacuate, but Pence refused. "I'm not leaving," Pence said. He knew the Secret Service would whisk him away if he stepped inside his vehicle. It would look like he was fleeing. "We've got to go now," Jebel said, the agent in charge, and suggested Pence sit in the vehicle. "I'm not getting in," Pence said. He said he would stand there and make calls with the motorcade humming, ready to go if the crisis worsened. Pence spoke by phone with McConnell and other leaders who said they needed the National Guard to move faster. The Capitol needed to be secured. McConnell asked, "Where were the troops? I will call them and call you back," Pence said. Even though his life was actively in danger, Pence remained at the Capitol because he didn't want the American people to think that their vice president was abandoning the situation. Anyway, as you may recall, the joint session had split 7 hours prior after the objection to the Arizona vote, and that process could now resume. Lawmakers would spend the next few hours giving speeches over what had transpired, but I think it's Mitt Romney, a man who almost came face to face with the violent mob, who put things best.
Now we gather due to a selfish man's injured pride and the outrage of supporters who he has deliberately misinformed for the past 2 months and stirred to action this very morning. What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States. Those who choose to continue to support his dangerous gambit by objecting to the results of a legitimate democratic election will forever be seen as being complicit in an unprecedented attack against our democracy. Fairly or not, they'll be remembered for their role in the shameful episode in American history. That will be their legacy.
At 10:15 p.m., the Senate would vote 93-6 against the Arizona objection, and at 11:30 p.m., the House would also vote 303-121 against it too. Now, given everything that had occurred today, you would hope that the Republicans who initially planned to make objections for the other states would just, shut the fuck up, but no. Despite everything that had already happened, it turns out that Rudy Giuliani was still desperately calling lawmakers to persuade them to object to the vote in a last-ditch effort to overturn the election. To quote one of Giuliani's voice messages that he sent to Senator Tuberville, "The only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow. So if you could object to every state, and along with the congressman, get a hearing for every state, I know it would delay you a lot, but it would give us the opportunity to get the legislators who are very, very close to pulling their vote." A woman had been shot dead due to these lies, and yet Giuliani still persisted. What a vile human being. But look, to Giuliani's credit, these calls were partially successful, as there would be further delays to the certification. After the joint session reconvened and Mike Pence reached the state of Pennsylvania at 12:15 a.m., Representative Scott Perry and Senator Josh Hawley would object to the count. There's this iconic moment where Mitt Romney death stared Hawley from behind as he announced his intentions to object to Pennsylvania, and that look embodied what most Americans were thinking at this time. This would result in another 3 hours of debate, but both chambers would ultimately vote against it. Finally, at 3:32 a.m. in the morning, after Mike Pence certified the vote in Wyoming, Congress would finish the count, and Joseph R. Biden would be certified as the 46th President of the United States. Despite everything Trump had tried for 9 months, his efforts to overturn the election were ultimately fruitless. On the morning of January 7th, as the dust began to settle, the gravity of what had just occurred really began to sink in. A violent mob, who'd been spoon-fed lies for several months by the President of the United States, had stormed the Capitol and attempted an insurrection. That was the word plastered on front pages all around the world, and even conservative commentators like Ben Shapiro were using it too.
And this was an attempted act of insurrection. I mean, technically speaking, that's what it was, considering that the reason that this happened is because Congress was simply there doing their constitutional duty and tabulating the state-certified electoral count.
And look, the extent of the harm caused was unmistakable. It's estimated that rioters caused $30 million in damages to the Capitol building, but obviously, that was just about the least important consequence of the attack. We already talked about Ashley Babbitt, who was shot and killed as she tried to climb through a door in the House chamber, but unfortunately, this was not the only death which occurred on January 6th. Amongst rioters, a man named Kevin Greason, who had a history of high blood pressure, suffered a heart attack outside the Capitol and wasn't able to be revived. Then, another man named Benjamin Phillips, who was the founder of a pro-Trump website called Trumparoo, died of a stroke whilst he was in the crowd. There was also a 35-year-old woman by the name of Roseanne Boyland, who died due to an accidental overdose or acute amphetamine intoxication, according to the DC Medical Examiner. Finally, an officer named Brian Sicknick collapsed at 10 p.m. in the Capitol and died the following day in hospital after suffering 2 strokes. Although his death was deemed to be of natural causes, he had been violently assaulted by 2 rioters earlier in the day with pepper spray, and the medical examiner noted all that transpired played a role in his condition. These were the 5 deaths which occurred during or in the immediate aftermath of the attack, but it unfortunately doesn't end there. On January 9th, Officer Howard Liebengood would take his own life, and 6 days after that, on January 15th, Officer Jeffrey Smith, who had been assaulted during the Capitol attack, would shoot himself in the head at the George Washington Memorial Parkway. Additionally, 6 months later in July, another 2 officers who defended the Capitol, named Gunther Hashida and Karl de Freytag, would also commit suicide. This is why you'll see 9 deaths attributed to January 6th, and it's obviously a very grim reality. On top of that, over 170 officers would be assaulted, resulting in injuries ranging from bruises and lacerations to more serious damage such as concussions, rib fractures, burns, and even a mild heart attack. Also, given how many suicides occurred, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that hundreds more were traumatized from the day's events. And look, to put it simply, Americans were outraged at what they had seen. The images bombarding television screens all around the country in the days and weeks that followed were almost unbelievable. There were the barricaded doors in the House, the scream of the QAnon shaman, lawmakers hiding under their seats, the Confederate flag waving outside the Senate chamber, and the damn gallows which had been set up in Union Square. As we saw, rioters had been chanting "Hang Mike Pence" as they stormed the building, and what words could possibly describe the insanity of that? This was supposed to be America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, one of the first modern democracies in the entire world, yet, over the course of one fateful day, their international reputation had been permanently scarred. A poll released 1 week after the attack found that almost 80% of Americans thought that the country was falling apart, and how could you blame them? 1/3 of people genuinely believed that the election had been stolen from Trump, and how could you possibly bridge that unreality? And, speaking of the president, his approval rating would drop to an all-time low, at least for that point in time, of 29% after the attack, with 68% of Americans saying that he shouldn't continue to be a major national political figure in the years to come. Boy oh boy, I sure hope that sentiment still exists in 4 years' time. But okay, that brings us to one of the most important parts of the January 6th aftermath, the criminal proceedings. As it turns out, violently forcing your way into the Capitol, smashing windows, breaking down doors, threatening lawmakers, assaulting police officers, and trying to start an insurrection are actually considered criminal offenses. Because of how destabilizing this attempted insurrection was on the whole idea of democracy in America, the judicial system would come down hard on rioters to send a clear message to the rest of the country. In fact, this would become the single largest criminal probe in the history of the US, with over 5,000 FBI employees working on the investigation at some point. So, out of the estimated 10,000 people who came onto Capitol grounds on January 6, there would be a total of 1,583 arrests. Now, technically speaking, anyone who was in the massive crowd of protesters outside the building was breaking the law because they were trespassing on federal property. However, because the Proud Boys removed those barriers earlier in the day, there were thousands of protesters coming from Trump's speech at the Ellipse who entered an area they had no idea was restricted. The footage makes this pretty clear because you can tell the vast majority of these people, especially those who are further back, are just peaceful protesters who are following instructions from their president. These people obviously didn't deserve to be charged, and guess what? Barring a few exceptions, none of them would be prosecuted. To quote Roger Parloff from Lawfare, merely stepping into the restricted zone around the Capitol alone was almost never enough to be charged, according to the department, which says it declined prosecution of about 400 such cases. With a handful of exceptions, only those who either entered the Capitol building itself or those who engaged in other crimes outside the building, i.e. assaulting or impeding officers, or destroying or stealing property were charged with these misdemeanor offenses. That's right, if you were charged with a crime in relation to January 6th, it's because you assaulted somebody or destroyed something, or, most commonly, you trespassed into the Capitol building itself, but even that wasn't a guarantee. The FBI estimates that somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 people entered the Capitol building on January 6th, but there were less than 1,600 charges made in total. Also, to me at least, this is the point where you lose the benefit of not realizing you were in a restricted area, because holy fuck, obviously a private citizen cannot freely enter the Capitol building as Congress is actively certifying an election. I hate to use this phrase because I made an entire video saying how stupid it was, but guys, that is just common fucking sense. I know the Capitol is sometimes referred to as the People's House, but that's a metaphor for representative democracy, not a license to trespass on federal property. A lot of rioters would try to feign ignorance about this in court, claiming that law enforcement allowed them to freely enter the Capitol and they didn't know what they were doing was illegal, but this failed almost every time it was tried. As you should be able to tell by all the footage that you've seen thus far, anyone who was inside the Capitol for more than 20 seconds knew what was going on. They would have seen broken glass, a violent mob attacking police officers, alarms blaring, people yelling, the sound of flashbangs, the smell of chemical irritants, and clouds of tear gas flooding the corridors. Unless you were blind and deaf and had no sense of anything, any reasonable person knew that they should not have been there. From what I could find in my research, only one rioter was able to successfully argue in court that they didn't know they were breaking the law when they entered the Capitol building, and I gotta be honest, that decision was a little fishy. He was found not guilty in a bench trial, i.e. there was no jury, and the judge who made the final decision was appointed by Trump himself, and it was later discovered that he had issued lighter sentences than prosecutors sought in 48 out of 50 of the January 6 cases that he handled. But anyway, I say all of that to make one thing clear. If you were caught inside the Capitol on January 6th, you weren't some innocent bystander or lost tourist being guided around by police, as some people in the media have tried to portray it. No. You were trespassing on federal property and deserve to face the full force of the law. And, just to be clear, that full force of the law wasn't all that severe anyway. The most common charge for non-violent rioters was parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building, which was only a misdemeanor. In most cases, this resulted in a $500 fine, 60 hours of community service, and at worst, like 2 weeks incarceration, which, all things considered, isn't that severe. By far the most important charges made in relation to January 6 were those handed down to members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. As we've already seen, these groups spent weeks carefully planning what they were going to do at the Capitol, and it was their actions which exacerbated so much of the violence and chaos we saw that day. Remember, the Proud Boys were the ones who tore down the initial barricades, they were the ones assaulting officers, and they were the ones who made the first breach into the Capitol itself. Additionally, and this is something I didn't mention in the previous section, but the Oath Keepers were extremely active on the ground during the attack as well. Their members coordinated 2 stack formations which were used to breach the Capitol at around 2:30 p.m. They attacked officers with pepper spray and flagpoles and also disarmed them by stealing their shields. Additionally, one of these stacks had the explicit goal of finding Nancy Pelosi, but fortunately, she had already been evacuated to a safe place. Also, to make these people's intentions even clearer, a recording would leak 4 days after the attack where Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, said this: "My only regret is they should have brought rifles. We should have brought rifles. We could have fixed it right then and there. I'd hang fucking Pelosi from the lamppost." Yeah, some really non-incriminating stuff. Ultimately, it would be Enrique Tarrio who walked away with the harshest sentence of anyone involved with January 6, as he was found guilty of seditious conspiracy, resulting in a 22-year prison sentence. During his trial, federal prosecutors would describe Tarrio's behavior as a, quote, calculated act of terrorism. Also, as we discussed earlier, it really doesn't help your case when you're caught sending messages like, "Make no mistake, we did this," as your foot soldiers breached the Capitol. Additionally, Stuart Rhodes would also be convicted of seditious conspiracy for his role in the attack and was handed down an 18-year prison sentence too. In total, 57 people would be charged with conspiracy, including 18 who were charged with seditious conspiracy, and these were by far the most serious convictions handed down in relation to January 6. Of course, we have a little more to talk about when it comes to these criminal proceedings after a little something happened in 2025, but we'll save that for the final section of this video. For now, we still have to talk about Trump's response to the attack in the days that followed because, well, it was a bit of a mixed bag. On the day after the attack, it seemed that Trump was a little more cognizant of the fact that his lies had gone way too far. At 7:35 p.m. that night, he would publish this video message.
I would like to begin by addressing the heinous attack on the United States Capitol. Like all Americans, I am outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem. The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy. To those who engaged in the acts of violence and destruction, you do not represent our country. And to those who broke the law, you will pay. A new administration will be inaugurated on January 20th. My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power. This moment calls for healing and reconciliation.
Exactly 2 months after Biden had been declared the winner of the 2020 election, Trump had finally conceded. Now sure, it was by no means an explicit concession, and outtakes would show that he was very careful with the language he used, and the New York Times would report 2 days later that he immediately regretted making these comments, but there was now at least a partial commitment to the transition of power. This saga was officially over, and Biden would become president on January 20th. Now, as you may recall, Trump was handed a 12-hour suspension from Twitter on January 6th, and if he wanted to make a permanent return to the platform, they publicly announced that he had to delete 3 of his tweets from the previous day, which had encouraged violence. Trump would actually oblige with this request, which is how he posted that concession video we just watched, but unfortunately for the president, his return to Twitter wouldn't last very long at all. The next morning on January 8th, barely 12 hours since he had been unsuspended, he was already back to his bullshit. The 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America First, and Make America Great Again will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. Well, I guess old habits die hard. 1 hour after that, Trump would publish his very last tweet for over 2 years. To all of those who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Now yes, Trump would be permanently suspended after this tweet was published, but I want to focus on what he actually said first because, well, he wasn't being completely honest here. That tweet framed it as though it was his decision to attend or not to attend Biden's inauguration, but this simply wasn't the case. As Jonathan Carr would reveal in his book, shortly before the president published this tweet, he had been informed that he would not be invited. That's right, after what had transpired on January 6th and his continual lying for months on end, the 45th president of the United States would not be allowed to attend the 46th president's inauguration. This came about because Mitch McConnell was worried that Trump would use the ceremony as yet another opportunity to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, so he instructed his aides to draft a letter with other leaders in Congress to tell the president that he was not welcome. However, Trump somehow caught wind of this plan early, and that's what prompted him to make his final tweet. Now look, I don't think that Trump was going to attend Biden's inauguration either way, but this move was basically the equivalent of resigning before your boss has a chance to fire you to protect your own pride and ego. Anyway, Twitter would announce his permanent suspension that night, and other platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat would also follow suit. Now, do I think there's a conversation to be had about the fact that private companies effectively deplatformed the President of the United States? Obviously yes, but there's no chance in hell we're opening that can of worms with how long this video already is. Anyway, that brings us to January 13th, when representatives would gather in the House chamber, which had been barricaded from rioters just 1 week prior, to vote on something pretty momentous. After his role in the violence and chaos which transpired on January 6th, Donald Trump was facing impeachment for incitement of insurrection. Because the Democrats held a significant majority in the House of Representatives, this resolution was going to pass no matter what happened. However, in an extremely telling move, 10 Republicans would cross the aisle and join the Democrats, which is the most members in history to vote to impeach a member of their own party. Ultimately, the resolution would pass 232 to 197, making Trump the only president in US history to be impeached twice. It would be a few weeks before the impeachment trial began in the Senate, and this left just one major event in Trump's presidency, Inauguration Day. He obviously wasn't going to be there for the ceremony itself, but at midday on January 20th, his chapter in American history would formally come to a close. At the exact same location where thousands of rioters had swarmed just a few weeks prior, Joseph R. Biden would take his oath to the Constitution, formally becoming the 46th President of the United States. Of course, this always should have been the outcome when the result of the election was announced on November 7th, but given everything Donald Trump had tried to do over the past 2 months, this moment was by no means guaranteed. Finally, Americans could let out a collective sigh of relief, or at least the 70% of them who thought Biden was the true winner of the 2020 election could. On February 9th, Trump's impeachment trial would begin in the Senate, but wait a minute, if he was no longer the president anymore, then why bother? Well, the reason Democrats pursued this so aggressively is because impeachment can also result in disqualification, i.e., a potential Trump 2024 presidential bid would be out of the question. This wasn't just some virtue signal by the Democrats with a symbolic trial to show how bad and evil Donald Trump was. No, they could actually put a permanent end to his political career if they succeeded here. And look, with how some of the president's former allies would talk about him in this trial, it looked as though there was a real shot of this happening.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth.
My lord, after hearing such a damning condemnation, you'd probably expect McConnell to be amongst the first to vote Trump as guilty, but no, you'd be wrong. Unfortunately, the outcome of this trial was all but guaranteed after the 26th of January, when nearly every Senate Republican came out and voted in favor of a motion that declared the trial unconstitutional. As the Republican argument went, Trump was now a private citizen, not the President of the United States, so he therefore couldn't be impeached. Now, I should note that the vast majority of scholars disagree with this reading of the Constitution, but that's honestly besides the point. Because a supermajority of 67 votes was needed for this to pass, and 45 Republicans had voted in favor of this motion, there was no chance that Trump would be convicted. Ultimately, after 5 days of deliberation, 57 senators found Trump guilty, 43 found him not guilty, and this meant they were 10 votes short of the 2/3 majority which was required. To be fair, 7 Republican senators would join the Democrats in voting guilty, but again, this wasn't enough, meaning Trump was officially acquitted and he could still run for president in 2024. It's a bit of a shame because basically every Republican agreed that Trump's actions were reprehensible, but they were able to hide behind this constitutional technicality, which, according to legal scholars, was probably bullshit. Just moments after the not guilty verdict was announced, Trump would publish this statement. This has been yet another phase of the greatest witch hunt in the history of our country. No president has ever gone through anything like it, and it continues because our opponents cannot forget the almost 75 million people, the highest number ever for a sitting president, who voted for us just a few short months ago. Our historic, patriotic, and beautiful movement to make America great again has only just begun. Together, there is nothing we cannot accomplish. That's right, the man who tried to annihilate the very idea of democracy in America was already angling for a 2024 comeback. How lovely. Now, unfortunately for Trump, there was one thing that could stop him from running for president again in 4 years' time, and that was a criminal conviction. Because guess what? Amongst the 1,583 people who were charged with an offense in relation to January 6th, well, one of them was Donald J. Trump. It wouldn't happen immediately, in fact it would take way too long to occur, but as the investigations into January 6th began, people were coming to a pretty clear-cut conclusion. On March 3rd, 2022, the January 6th committee would announce that they have a, quote, good faith basis for concluding that the president and members of his campaign engaged in a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States. 8 months later in November, Attorney General Merrick Garland would name Jack Smith, perhaps the single most normal name for a man ever, as special counsel to investigate Trump's involvement in January 6th, and 8 months after that, a criminal indictment would be filed against the former president. Due to his unlawful efforts to overturn the election, Trump was facing 4 charges: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights, specifically voter rights. Trump would plead not guilty, with his lawyers arguing that the charges were unconstitutional because of presidential immunity, and look, this is where things start to get really messy. To be abundantly clear, I am by no means a legal expert, but I'm going to do my best to explain what happened here because it's crucial. Basically, as soon as these charges were laid against the president, his legal team developed one clear strategy: delay. 4 months before a grand jury approved the criminal indictment, Trump had formally announced that he would be running for president again in 2024, which meant the clock was ticking. Simply put, if he somehow managed to win in 2024, this election interference case was going to be dropped instantaneously. Just listen to Trump explain how.
So you're going to have a very tough choice the day after you take the oath of office, or maybe even the day that you take the oath of office. You're either going to have to pardon yourself or you're going to have to fire Jack Smith. Which one will you do?
Oh, it's so easy. It's so easy. I would fire him within 2 seconds.
Now, he was being a little hyperbolic here because the president doesn't have the authority to fire a special counsel like Jack Smith, but he could appoint an attorney general who would do it for him. So, in essence, Trump's legal troubles would all but evaporate if he won re-election, so his goal became, how can we make sure all of these trials start after November 5th, 2024. You can clearly see the strategy in action when Trump was initially charged in August of 2023, as his legal team asked the judge if they could schedule the trial for April of 2026, which was more than 2.5 years away. By contrast, Smith's team requested a start date of January 2024, with the judge ultimately settling on March 2024. On October 5th, before the trial had begun, Trump's lawyers would move to dismiss this case, citing the absolute immunity he held as president, which prevents any prosecution. We won't dive too deep into the weeds of this because it's very complicated, but historically speaking, immunity had only ever applied to civil cases, and this was the first time a president was trying to apply it to a criminal case. Most legal scholars thought what Trump's team was doing here was laughable, and on December 1st, Tanya Chutkan, the district judge presiding over the case, denied Trump's request for dismissal, writing, "Whatever immunities a sitting president may enjoy, the United States has only one chief executive at a time, and that position does not confer a lifelong get-out-of-jail free pass." Trump's legal team would appeal this decision, which was going to cost the case a lot of time, which is obviously what they were wanting. So, on December 11th, Jack Smith would try to expedite this process by making a request to go straight to the Supreme Court. This would allow them to leapfrog the Court of Appeals, which is the next one up in the hierarchy, buying them precious time for the trial. Within hours of making this request, the Supreme Court said it would consider it, but 11 days later on December 22nd, they said, "Fuck you, Jack Smith, you gotta do it the normal way before you can get to us," and this added several months to the whole process. Now, to be fair, it is very rare that a case goes straight to the Supreme Court, but everyone knew it was going to end up there, given how high the stakes were. Anyway though, on January 9th, the Court of Appeals would hear arguments from Trump's legal team, and exactly 1 month later on February 9th, they would also reject his case, writing, "We cannot accept that the office of the presidency places its former occupants above the law for all time thereafter." As expected, Trump would file an emergency application to the Supreme Court after this decision was made, and oh my god, you'll never believe this, but they accepted his case. The hearing would begin on April 25th, and remember, until the Supreme Court reached a final decision on this case, Trump's trial could not proceed. Ultimately, it would take 70 days of deliberation for them to reach a decision, and my god, did they come to a decision. In what legal scholars have labeled as one of, if not the worst judgment by the Supreme Court in modern American history, they ruled in Trump's favor and effectively granted the president the quote, power of a king. To quote directly from their 6-3 decision, a former president is entitled to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. Basically, to give a TLDR on what this decision meant, if the president were to stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot some random person, that would thankfully not be covered by presidential immunity. Because indiscriminately murdering people on the street isn't really relevant to the president's constitutional role as the head of the executive, they could be prosecuted for such an offense. However, to borrow an example from Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissenting opinion, if the president ordered the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, well, because commanding the military is one of the president's core constitutional powers, they would have total immunity for that offense. Now look, don't get me wrong, this was an absolutely insane decision by the Supreme Court, but the details of it aren't super relevant to what we're talking about. The one important takeaway from this case is that the decision was handed down on July 1st, which meant Jack Smith only had 4 months to convict Trump before the election, and that didn't seem very likely. On August 27th, Smith would adjust his charges against Trump with the Supreme Court's ruling in mind. He would again plead not guilty, and his legal team would request to push back the deadline for their reply from October 17th to November 7th, aka 2 days after the election. The clock had officially run out, and if Trump did happen to win the election against Kamala Harris on November 5th, well, any chance of a conviction would be dead in the water. All anyone could do was sit back, cross their fingers, and pray to God that he didn't win. You know what happened next. We all know what happened next. We're currently living through what happened next. When Americans went back to the polls in 2024, they decided to re-elect the man who instigated an attack on the Capitol and tried to eviscerate the idea of democracy in America 4 years prior. Not gonna lie, there's a bit of a tragic irony in that, isn't there? If the stakes weren't so incredibly high, it would be kind of funny that a nation voluntarily put a man like that back in charge. This meant that Donald Trump had completed perhaps the single most impressive political comeback in human history. And yes, I use the term impressive very intentionally because this is a guy who should have been in jail for the crimes he committed, yet he somehow found himself as the leader of the free world once again. And guess what? When Trump surpassed 270 electoral votes, do you know what Kamala Harris did? Yeah, She conceded the election. She didn't claim there was widespread fraud, she didn't try to pressure state officials into giving her 11,000 extra votes, she didn't create a false slate of electors who would go and vote for her anyway, and she didn't spend 2 months peddling conspiracy theories to her fanatical supporters. At 4 p.m. on November 6th, Kamala Harris got up in front of the entire nation and congratulated Trump on his election victory, which is a very foreign concept to a man who is yet to acknowledge Joseph Biden as the true winner of the 2020 election. Not only did this victory guarantee Trump another 4 years in the Oval Office, it also meant that his legal strategy had worked perfectly. On November 25th, Jack Smith would ask Judge Chutkan to dismiss the case due to the Justice Department's long-standing policy which barred the prosecution of a sitting president. The request was approved and that was basically that. The case was dismissed without prejudice, which means in all likelihood, Donald Trump will never face any form of accountability for everything he did in 2020. Sensing the inevitable, Jack Smith would resign from the Department of Justice on January 12th before whatever crony that Trump appointed as Attorney General could fire him. As a parting gift, Smith was able to publish his final report on the case to the public, and if I had to distill the 174-page document into my own words, it'd be something like, yeah, look, we had mountains of evidence to prove Trump's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but you fuckers decided to vote him back in, so now we can't get a criminal conviction. Tough luck. On January 20th, 2025, Trump would be inaugurated as president for a second time, and boy, this is where things get really good. Ever since January 29th in 2022, at a rally in Conroe, Texas, Trump had been teasing the idea of a pardon for anyone convicted in relation to January 6th.
If I run and if I win, we will treat those people from January 6th fairly. We will treat them fairly. And if it requires pardons, we will give them pardons because they are being treated so unfairly.
This was a complete 180 from what Trump had said during his final days in office. He was no longer advocating for law and order and actually punishing the rioters. No. Instead, pardons were now on the table. There was even this utterly absurd moment at a rally in March of 2023 where Trump decided to play a version of the national anthem sung by the J6 prison choir. This was a group of rioters who were stuck behind bars who sang the national anthem every night before they went to sleep, and Trump thought this was the perfect opportunity to play their song. What the fuck? He'd also do this a year later at another campaign rally, but I digress. By the time Trump had won the 2024 election, these pardons were clearly a priority for his administration, as he made very clear during an interview with NBC in December.
I'm going to be acting very quickly.
Within your first 100 days, first day?
First day.
First day.
Yeah, I'm looking first day.
Issue these pardons.
These people have been there, how long is it? 3 or 4 years?
Okay.
You know, by the way, they've been in there for years, and they're in a filthy, disgusting place that shouldn't even be allowed to be open.
That's right. These pardons were going to be a first-day priority when Trump got back into office. But okay, there was still a pretty important question at play here. Just who exactly was going to be pardoned? Remember, there had been some really serious offenses committed on January 6th, so surely not everybody was going to get a pardon, right? Well, fortunately for us, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance would give us a pretty clear answer to this question just 1 week before Trump's inauguration.
January 6th pardons, President Trump says there's a process. Where is the line drawn on who will and wouldn't be considered for a pardon?
I think it's very simple. Look, if you protested peacefully on January the 6th and you've had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned. And there's a little bit of a gray area there, but we're very much committed to seeing the equal administration of law. And there are a lot of people, we think, in the wake of January the 6th who were prosecuted unfairly. We need to rectify that.
Now, just to be clear, the idea that there was a group of peaceful protesters who were treated unfairly by Biden's Justice Department is just simply wrong. As we talked about previously, if you were convicted in relation to January 6th, it's because you trespassed into the Capitol building itself, in which case you weren't even given that severe of a punishment anyway, or you attacked an officer, or you damaged property, or you tried to plan a literal insurrection. But whatever. At least Vance was clear that no violent offenders would be receiving a pardon, so I guess we just had to wait and see who Trump decided to pardon.
First, we have a list of pardons and commutations relating to events that occurred on January 6, 2021.
Okay, and how many people is this?
I think this order will apply to approximately 1,500 people, sir.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
Yes.
Full pardon.
Full pardon or commutation?
Full pardon. We have about 6 commutations in there where we're doing further research.
Everybody who received a conviction in relation to January 6th was either pardoned or had their sentence commuted. Not even the most devout Trump loyalists were expecting this outcome because of how serious some of the convictions were. For example, David Dempsey, a 37-year-old who beat officers with a flagpole and stomped on their heads, pardoned. Peter Schwartz, a man with 38 prior convictions who used stolen pepper spray to attack officers, also pardoned. Daniel Rodriguez, that 40-year-old man who tased Officer Fanone in the neck, which caused him to fall unconscious and suffer a heart attack, also pardoned. Additionally, there would be 14 sentences commuted for members of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. Now, if you're wondering what the difference is, a pardon basically removes a criminal conviction, like it never happened in the first place, whereas a commuted sentence keeps the record, but it either partially or entirely removes the punishment associated with it. This meant that Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes, 2 men who had been found guilty of seditious conspiracy and were supposed to be behind bars for like 20 years each, were walking free from jail less than 24 hours after Trump signed this executive order. And as the nice little cherry on top of all of this, Trump also instructed the DOJ to drop all of its pending cases in relation to January 6th. And look, you may have actually seen these pardoned rioters popping up in the news over the past several months because they haven't really been model citizens. As an investigation from Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington discovered in December of 2025, at least 33 of the pardoned rioters are now facing other criminal charges ranging from, and sorry, this is a long list, child sexual assault, production of child pornography, possession of child pornography, rape, conspiracy to commit murder of FBI agents, kidnapping, sexual assault, aggravated robbery, reckless homicide, driving under the influence causing death, illegal possession of firearms, domestic violence by strangulation, burglary, vandalism, grand theft, stalking, violation of protective orders, threatening public officials, and drug trafficking. Perhaps worst of all, a rioter by the name of Andrew Johnson, seen here crawling through a broken window to breach the Capitol, was sentenced to life in prison for molesting 2 children in March of this year. Now look, I'm not trying to suggest that literally everybody who is pardoned is a child sex offender, but they are people who have shown a propensity to engage in criminal behavior at least once in their lifetime. This is especially relevant when it comes to the violent offenders, as it's absolutely outrageous that they were allowed to walk free when Trump himself told the country on January 12th, 2021 that there's, quote, never a justification for violence and that those who engage in the attacks will be, quote, brought to justice. Put simply, you cannot be the party of law and order when you don't respect either law or order. And God, those pardons were just a warm-up because this is where we get to the even more insane stuff. How good is this? Are you having a good time? I'm having a good time. Ever since Trump has been back in the Oval Office, the revisionist history his administration has undertaken to completely rewrite the events of January 6th is genuinely scary. To see what I mean, look no further than the webpage published on the White House's official website to mark the 5th anniversary of January 6th. Not only do they try to frame the entire thing as Nancy Pelosi's fault, they also produce a timeline of events which contains so many outright lies, it's kinda hard to comprehend. Firstly, it outright labels the 2020 election as stolen, which is obviously not true, as proven by Trump's 61 out of 62 failed lawsuits. Secondly, it pins responsibility for the violence on Capitol Police when we know it was the Proud Boys who tore down the barricades, riled up the crowds, assaulted officers, and physically breached the Capitol themselves, as they planned to do for several weeks. Thirdly, and this is my favorite part of the webpage by far, it says that Trump was, quote, urging calm from 2:24 p.m. to 4:17 p.m., which is a very interesting time period to select. As you may remember, 2:24 p.m. is the exact time that Trump issued a certain tweet as rioters were actively breaching the Capitol, and I'll just read it out to you now as a little reminder. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. I'm not really sure if we can call that urging peace, as it's more akin to pouring gasoline on an open fire. Fourth, it claims that Ashley Babbitt was murdered when she categorically wasn't, as subsequent investigations proved. Fifth, it perpetuates the lie that Mike Pence had the power to send the electoral votes back to the states, which is something 99% of constitutional scholars deemed illegal. And finally, it presents this pathetic sob story of how all the rioters and Trump were just victims of a weaponized justice system, when no, they were all criminals facing the consequences of their criminal actions. I thought propaganda was supposed to be subtle these days because this webpage is just some Nazi Germany level shit. Also, more recently in May, the Department of Justice acknowledged that it had removed web pages containing details on charges, convictions, and other information relating to the defendants involved in January 6th. To directly quote a tweet published on the DOJ Rapid Response Twitter account, "We are proud to reverse the DOJ's weaponization under the Biden administration. We will do everything in our power to make whole those who were prosecuted for political purposes. This includes stripping DOJ's website of partisan propaganda." And look, when the most powerful man in the world insists on doing a little bit of revisionist history, it can actually have some pretty unsettling effects on the health of your democracy. Nothing, and I mean nothing, makes this clearer than the dozens and dozens of federal judges and other Trump appointees who have refused to acknowledge Biden as the winner of the 2020 election during their confirmation hearings. The montage I'm about to play for you is, and I know this term has been memed to death on the internet, but it's the most Orwellian 1984 bullshit that I've ever seen from the US government.
Let's start with an easy question to show that you have some independence from the president. Easy yes or no. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 presidential election?
Thank you, Senator Warren. Joe Biden was certified by Congress as the president of the United States.
Right. So did Donald Trump lose that election?
As I just said, Joe Biden was certified by the Congress.
Did Donald Trump lose that election? Can you say the words Donald Trump lost that election? Are you independent enough to say that?
The Congress certified Joe Biden as president.
All right.
Who won the popular vote in 2020?
Senator, in 2020, President Biden was certified and served 4 years as president.
Who won the popular vote?
Senator, the same answer. President Biden was certified.
St. John?
Senator, Joe Biden was certified the winner of the 2020 election and served 4 years.
Judge Shepard?
Senator President Biden was certified the winner and served 4 years.
Mr. Wolf?
Same answer, Senator.
But what's so hard about just saying that Biden won the 2020 election? What's hard about that?
Senator, as I've said before, that President Biden was certified and sworn in, and he was the president. I don't know how else to say it.
Well, the other way to say it is he won.
He was the president.
The other way to say it is he won.
Who won the 2020 election?
I'd say that President Biden was certified the winner of the 2020 election.
He won the election. Is that your response?
Senator, I think my response is he was certified as the winner by counting the electoral.
So you're unwilling to say he won the election. How about you, Mr. Roberts?
I have the same answer as my colleague, Senator.
Same answer as the previous one?
The previous nominee. The Senate did.
Mr. Coons, how about you?
Thank you, Senator. And I have the same answer as Mr.
Same
Hancock.
answer.
Who won the 2020 presidential election?
Joe Biden is the President of the United States.
Who won the popular vote, Mr. Schwartz, in the 2020 election?
Sitting here as a judicial nominee, I'm bound by the codes of conduct, and I can't answer that question in the way you want me to, because the only legally and ethically correct answer is the one that prior nominees have given, which is that Joe Biden was certified as president in 2020.
Do you believe he lost the 2020 election?
I think that Donald Trump and I have both raised a number of issues with the 2020 election, but we're focused on the future. I think there's an obsession here with focusing on 2020. I'm much more worried about what happened after 2020, which is a wide open border, groceries that are unaffordable. And look,
Senator,
Lulu,
yes or no?
Okay.
Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Let me ask you a question. Is it okay that big technology companies censored the Hunter Biden laptop story, which independent analysis have said cost Donald Trump millions of votes?
Senator Vance, I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Did big technology companies censor a story that independent studies have suggested would have cost Trump millions of votes?
Senator Vance, I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020
election? And I've answered
election?
your question with another question. You answer my question and I'll answer yours.
Who won the 2020 election?
I'm not going to do this with you.
This is a job interview. We've established that you have an obligation to be honest and forthright with the committee. Yes, you do have an obligation to be honest and forthright with the committee?
Yes.
Who won the 2020 election?
Like I said, I'm not going to get into that with you.
But you do have an obligation to be honest and forthright with the committee.
Is anything that I just said not honest or forthright?
Yes, you're not being honest or forthright. Who won the 2020 election?
I think I've answered the question. We can keep doing this.
Well, we're going to keep doing it because you're not being honest and forthright.
I'm not going to engage in the theater.
It's a simple question, Mr. Clayton.
And I've answered
Who
it.
won the 2020 presidential election?
I've answered it.
You're here asking for the support of senators to lead America's intelligence community. We've established that you have an obligation to be honest and forthright with this committee and with the American public, but you refuse to answer a simple matter of fact about the 2020 election. Is that right?
No, that's not right.
Then answer the question. Who won the 2020 election?
I have answered the question.
Answer it. What is your answer?
I've given you my answer.
What is your answer? You refuse to answer a basic question about who won a presidential election, but you asked to lead America's intelligence community? Isn't it humiliating to be unable to answer this question, to have to indulge the president's delusions? We know, you know, everybody in this room knows the truthful answer to that question. Why can you not give it?
I think I gave you the answer.
Remember, for the separation of powers to function, you know, that core pillar of American democracy, you need a judicial branch which is independent, yet here you have federal judges refusing to acknowledge Biden as the winner of the 2020 election because they're scared of the blowback it will generate from the president. There were also reports at the start of 2025 that candidates for top national security positions in the Trump administration were faced with questions like this. Who were the real patriots on January 6th? Who won the 2020 election? Who is your real boss? Was January 6th an inside job? That's right, loyalty tests to the president as a prerequisite to work for the American government. What? I know I'm getting increasingly unhinged here, but I seriously cannot comprehend the state of the American government. I mean, fuck, even as I was writing and researching for this video, the Justice Department announced a $1.776 billion slush fund for victims of, quote, government weaponization. Right now, it looks as though January 6th rioters will be eligible for those payments, and just think about that. The 1,600 people who either pleaded guilty or were found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of engaging in criminal activity on January 6th were not only pardoned by Trump, which was insane on its own, but they also might receive money from the government because they're victims who were unfairly targeted? Like God, you know something is really bad when Legal Eagle opens a video on a topic like this.
This is the most flagrantly, staggeringly, obscenely corrupt thing that Trump has ever done in office. What Trump is doing here is creating an illegal fund of billions of dollars to pay out whomever he chooses, including and especially the traitors who breached the Capitol and tried to overturn the election to turn it over in Trump's favor. My blood is boiling. This is a new low for this administration. And this is an administration that has been rife with corruption and illegality, but this is probably the worst thing that they have done so far.
And look, I think that brings me to my final point in all of this. How did Trump win re-election in 2024? After his attempts to overturn a legitimate election in 2020, which culminated in an attack on the Capitol, how did Americans still vote for this guy? Did people simply forget just how bad it was after 4 years of a Trumpless political landscape? That's what I thought initially, but then I kind of realized something. Maybe Americans never learned the full extent of their president's actions in the first place. Before researching this video, I always knew that January 6th was bad, and I thought it was silly how Trump insisted that the election was stolen, but I never knew the desperate lengths he actually went to. Seriously, how many Americans do you think know about the Raffensperger call where he literally asked a state official to find him 11,000 votes? How many Americans know that Mike Pence never had the power to reject electoral votes? And, most importantly, do Americans know just how baseless his claims of election fraud actually were? Do they know that almost every single one of his legal challenges failed in court? Do they know his closest advisors, like Attorney General Bill Barr, were actively investigating every allegation of fraud but we're simply finding nothing? I only know how baseless it all was because I've spent hundreds of hours reading and writing about it, but how much does the average American know? I just can't shake this image in my mind of the median voter in America who doesn't have the time to watch the news all day and they're not very invested in politics, who thinks, well, with how hard Trump was complaining about election fraud in 2020, there surely must have been something to it, right? But it's like, no, there was never a semblance of truth to any of the claims he was making in 2020. All of it, and I mean all of it, was the desperate last attempt of a megalomaniac to stay in power after they lost the election. That's simply it. And look, sure, I get it. Biden was in cognitive decline and had perhaps the single most embarrassing debate performance in presidential history in the lead up to the 2024 election. Additionally, the way in which Kamala Harris was awkwardly subbed in as a replacement for Biden when she wasn't particularly popular wasn't a great look either. But like, come on, when you compare that to Donald J. Trump as a candidate, how is that a debate? Even if you ignore everything relating to January 6th, for some reason, this was a dude who was found civilly liable for rape. He entered the 2024 presidential campaign with 90 felony charges across 4 indictments. Also, did you all just forget about 2020 and his mismanagement of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter in the final year of his first term? Well, clearly, because just look at what's happened since his return to the presidency. It's literally been that meme of when the riff comes back, but it's slower and nastier. Power has never been more concentrated in the executive. He's blatantly thrown checks and balances to the side to push through his tariffs and other controversial changes. He stacked his cabinet with incompetent loyalists, and the degree of brutality and authoritarianism we've seen with ICE raids and the illegal wars he's declared on Iran and Venezuela, it's just astonishing. Like, the fact I can literally go to any betting website right now and find markets for will Trump run for a 3rd term in 2028 is a testament to all of this insanity. The warning signs were all there as his first term came to its pathetic close, but it wasn't heeded by a majority of Americans. I mean, sure, they realize it now after voting him back in, as his net approval rating is the lowest it's ever been, at like -25 is what my script says, but that was 2 months ago, and I'm pretty sure it's even lower than that now, but what type of consolation prize is that? Hopefully Republicans get wiped out at the upcoming midterm elections, which is set to happen, but with how concentrated power is in the executive branch of government right now, what will it ultimately change? Trump version 2.0 issued more executive orders in his first year than he did in his entire first term. Anyway, sorry, I've had a lot of things bubbled up for a while now, and this video seemed like the perfect opportunity to let it all out. But okay, to tie this all together, I want to bring everything back to this one final point. It's not the most profound thought in the entire world, but it's the thought my mind has come back to time and time again for the last 5 months. After Trump arrived back at the White House from his speech at the Ellipse, he sat there for hours and hours watching Fox News with a Diet Coke in his hand. We know he was watching the chaos unfold on his television, we know that he was getting constant updates from his inner circle, and we know that dozens and dozens of people were trying to reach out to him and Mark Meadows to get him to tell the rioters to leave the Capitol, and yet he did nothing. In my view, there's a pretty simple reason for this. He wanted it to work. As Fox News showed him thousands and thousands of his ardent supporters flooding the Capitol, he thought there was a chance that they could actually stop the certification. That's why he never called law enforcement or the National Guard or anyone for that matter. If he did, that would have quashed the insurrection immediately and blown his last opportunity of staying in power. And look, isn't that the perfect microcosm for this entire saga? There were never any principles, there was no regard for what was right, and he certainly never cared about the truth. The only thing that ever mattered to him was overturning the election, and if there was something he could do to help facilitate that goal, no matter how morally abhorrent or illegal it was, then that's exactly what he'd do. Even as violence erupted at the Capitol and a woman was shot dead, telling the rioters to leave would undermine his goal. So he didn't, because there was a chance of making him president again. In his mind, that was the right thing to do. It's kind of fucked that this man will never be held accountable for what he did to American democracy, but at the very least, you're one more person who knows the full truth of what actually transpired on January 6th. There's obviously a few things I had to cut out of this video. One particular case comes to mind involving the acting attorney general after Bill Barr resigned. Trump tried to put in this loyalist who was some random, I think he worked in like the environmental court, and then Trump saw him at a meeting and was like, that guy's a loyalist who wants to overturn the election, and he almost put him in power, my voice going, he almost put him in power was going to remove the acting attorney general, but then the whole DOJ threatened mass resignations if Trump did that because it would have been fucked. I had to admit that. There were also pipe bombs. I kept meant to including pipe bombs. There were pipe bombs on January 6th. Someone put a pipe bomb at the DNC headquarters. Someone put a pipe bomb at the RNC headquarters. That's another thing I probably should have mentioned, come to think of it, but here we are. With that being said, thank you for watching again. Make sure to check out the Discord. I'm going to be more active in there. Check out the Instagram, Twitter, and if you really enjoyed, you can join the Patreon and appear. I think I have one patron at the time of recording. So boom, he gets the whole thing. But yeah, if you really enjoyed, you can check that out. I'd really appreciate this. This video took 5 months, I think, by the time you're seeing it. But that's everything I got to say. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. And hopefully the next one comes a little quicker. We're not doing 4 hours again. We'll do 2 hours. I don't even know how long this is. Probably 4 hours? I'm going to say 4 hours. Thank you. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.